Prepare for a leisurely and tranquil journey into the ancient mysteries of the Delphic Oracle, a world shrouded in mysticism and grand legends. Let a gentle light envelop you, and your daily worries subside as we embark on this unforgettable voyage together. Imagine yourself as a traveller, making your way along a dusty mountain trail, where each step echoes through millennia. The warm Mediterranean sun graces your shoulders as you ascend, slowly but steadily, the slopes of mighty Mount Parnassus. Below, as far as the eye can see, endless olive groves stretch out like a green sea, reaching toward the distant blue horizon. But your destination is not the coast. You climb higher, following a path polished by the countless feet of pilgrims over hundreds of years. Allow yourself to relax, perhaps put on some soft background noise, and we will begin our ascent. As you press onward, you start to notice other travellers sharing your path. Here is an Athenian merchant, his donkey heavily laden with pottery, and beside him a farmer's wife carrying a humble offering, carefully wrapped in linen. Just ahead walks a young warrior, his bronze armour gleaming in the sun, shield strapped to his back, and spear resting peacefully in his hand. All move with the same silent determination. All are headed to the same sacred place. You are all going to Delphi, the most revered sanctuary in the ancient world, a place where the great Apollo himself, as legend has it, descends to commune with mortals. But the question arises, how did this mountain acquire such exceptional significance? How did this rocky slope, overgrown with wild laurel trees, transform into the spiritual centre of the ancient world? The history of this place is rooted in the distant past, long before the appearance of majestic temples and priests, when the world was still young and ancient gods walked the earth. This mountainside was sacred even then, but not to Apollo. Long ago, before the golden-haired god of music and prophecy claimed this territory, it belonged to an entirely different being. Deep beneath the rocks, in a cave that gaped like a huge maw in the mountainside, resided Python, not just a snake basking on a garden wall. Python was colossal, a serpent so enormous that, coiling around the mountain, its mighty body carved out the very paths pilgrims now ascend to the summit. Python was ancient, born of the earth itself in the nascent days of the world. Some legends say that after the great waters of Deucalion's flood receded, leaving the land muddy and fertile, this massive serpent lived in the cave for so long that the locals built their own sacred traditions around it. An oracle already existed in the cave, a way for mortals to communicate with divine forces. But this oracle served the old gods, the chthonic powers that reigned before Zeus and his family asserted their dominion in the heavens. People came from all corners of the Greek world to ask their questions of Python's oracle. They brought offerings of honey and barley cakes, and a priestess interpreted the serpent's movements, the slight tremors of the earth as Python stirred in its deep cave, and the whimsical patterns of vapour rising from the rock crevices. It was a peaceful coexistence, lasting for generations, until Apollo decided that this place should belong to him. Apollo was young then, by the standards of the gods. He was born on the floating island of Delos with his twin sister Artemis. His mother Leto had wandered the world seeking refuge for childbirth as Hera, ever jealous of Zeus's children by other women, had forbidden any land from offering her shelter. But Apollo grew with astonishing speed, as divine children are wont to do. Within days of his birth, he was tall, handsome and strong. His golden hair caught the light as if woven from sunbeams. His voice, when he sang, could move even stones to tears with its beauty. And he inherited from his father, Zeus, an unyielding determination to get what he wanted. Apollo yearned for his own oracle, his own sacred place where mortals could come to inquire about the future. But he didn't want just any mountain or any cave. He aimed for the best. He wanted the most renowned oracle in all the known world. He wanted Delphi. So Apollo ascended the mountain path much as you might walk it today, though his divine feet likely raised no dust clouds, and his breath certainly did not quicken with the effort of the climb. Gods do not tire. When he reached the sacred cave, he summoned Python. What happened next depends on who tells the story. Some claim it was a grand battle where Python's massive coils crushed trees and Apollo's silver arrows flew like falling stars. Others say it was more like a cosmic negotiation, with much divine posturing and threats, but little actual violence. But what we know for sure is this. When the confrontation ended, Python was dead, and Apollo declared the cave and the oracle his own. One might expect Apollo to simply adopt the existing traditions, allowing things to continue as they were. But Apollo was a god of change, of new ideas, of order that arises from art and music, from carefully considered thought. The old chthonic oracle was mysterious and primal, all vapour and serpent dreams and ancient wisdoms rising from deep places within the mountain. Apollo's oracle was to be different. First, he needed to purify the sight. The ancient Greeks believed that death, even the death of a being as ancient and powerful as Python, left a spiritual stain that needed to be cleansed before new sacred work could begin. So Apollo performed rituals of purification, burning fragrant herbs and pouring wine and oil onto the stones, chanting hymns that echoed from the mountain peaks. But even purification was not enough. Apollo had killed Python, and in the ancient world that made him a murderer. Even gods had to account for killing. So Apollo left his new sanctuary and journeyed far, to the land of the Hyperboreans in the distant north, where he spent 8 years in exile, atoning for Python's death. 8 long years. Imagine this mountain without its new god, empty of pilgrims, the cave entrance dark and silent. The local inhabitants must have wondered if their sacred site would ever come alive again. The merchants, farmers and warriors who had ascended the mountain path for generations must have felt lost, cut off from the divine guidance they had always known. But after 8 years, Apollo returned. And when he returned, he brought with him the most beautiful temple the ancient world had ever seen. In truth, it wasn't quite like that. Apollo didn't so much bring a temple as inspire people to build one. The returning god infused the local communities with a kind of divine enthusiasm, a shared vision of what this sacred place could become. Stonemasons began to arrive from all over Greece, and with them, architects, artists, and craftsmen of all kinds. The temple they built was designed to be perfect in every way. Its columns were precisely proportioned according to mathematical principles that would later be called the golden ratio. Its sculptures were carved by the greatest artists of the age. And inside, in the adyton, the innermost sanctuary where only the priestess could enter, Apollo placed his sacred tripod, a 3-legged bronze seat that would become the throne of his oracle. But the question arises, if Apollo was a god who spoke through an oracle, why did he need a priestess at all? Why didn't he speak directly to the people who came with questions? This is one of those wonderful mysteries of the ancient world that we will likely never fully understand. Perhaps Apollo, being a god of harmony and balance, believed that divine truth needed to be filtered through human understanding to be useful to the mortal mind. Perhaps the overwhelming power of a god's direct voice would have been too much for ordinary people. Or perhaps, and this explanation makes the most sense if you think about it quietly, Apollo understood that the very act of asking questions and seeking guidance was as important as the answers themselves. Think about it. You spend hours climbing a dusty mountain trail. You stand in line with other pilgrims. All of you are nervous, hopeful, and uncertain. You make your offering and speak your question aloud to the priestess who serves as the god's voice. And then you listen, truly listen to the answer you receive. This whole process changes you. The journey, the waiting, the moment of asking the question, the careful attention to the answer, all of it together creates a kind of meditation, a deep reflection on your life and your choices that you might never have undertaken if Apollo had simply appeared in your living room and answered your questions while you folded laundry. The oracle at Delphi was not just a way to get information about the future. It was about the experience of seeking wisdom, the spiritual discipline of asking the right questions and an honest openness to guidance, even when that guidance might not be what you wanted to hear. And Apollo's oracle became known for giving guidance that was technically accurate, but required careful interpretation. The god was not trying to be difficult or enigmatic simply for the sake of mystery. He was teaching people to reflect deeply on their choices, to consider multiple possibilities, to approach important decisions with the kind of thoughtful deliberation that leads to wisdom. And people came. Oh, how they came. Kings and farmers, soldiers and merchants, young brides and anxious mothers, philosophers and poets and politicians. They came from all corners of the Greek world and in time from beyond. They brought offerings of gold and silver, bronze tripods and fine cloths, animals for sacrifice and simple flowers gathered along the mountain path. And slowly, over years, decades and centuries, Apollo's oracle at Delphi became something more than just a sacred place. It became the spiritual center of an entire civilization. A place where Greeks from different cities could meet on common ground, where important decisions about war and peace, about founding new colonies, about laws and festivals, and the great questions of life were brought for divine guidance. Quiet sanctuary on Parnassus. Life in Delphi. Long ago a god, once a daring and youthful rebel who dared to appropriate another's sacred cave to fulfill his grand designs, created a truly blessed place. It was a space where heaven and earth touched, where the boundless wisdom of the celestials could address the earthly concerns of human hearts. And late at night, when the last pilgrim, having received an answer, began their descent from the mountain, when the temple lights barely flickered and the mountain plunged into a tranquil gloom, Apollo himself would sometimes take up his golden lyre. He would draw from it music that echoed from the mountain peaks to the deepest valleys. This music was so wonderfully beautiful that even wild animals would descend to the temple steps to listen. It seemed to embody all the joy and sorrow of mortal existence, transforming them into something eternal and perfect. The god who foretold the future found his true purpose here. It was not simply to predict future events, but to inspire people to reflect deeply on what was to come. Not just to provide answers to questions, but to teach mortals how to formulate deeper and more meaningful inquiries. And so tomorrow, when the sun rises over majestic Mount Parnassus and the first rays touch the temple columns, new pilgrims will begin their ascent along the ancient path. They will follow in the footsteps of countless seekers of truth who came before them. All harbour the hope of hearing the voice of a God who chose to speak through human wisdom rather than by divine command. But how did this oracle function day to day? What was it like to live and work in the most sacred corner of the ancient world? Let us climb a little higher into the mountains and glimpse into that life. A rooster's cry rings out just as the first pale light touches the peaks of Mount Parnassus. Down in the valley, the world still slumbers beneath the soft blanket of pre-dawn darkness. But here in Delphi, the sacred precinct is already beginning to stir. A man awakens in a small stone house built into the hillside. It is one of dozens of such dwellings that cluster around the great temple, like children gathered at their mother's skirt. Through his narrow window he sees the temple columns, already catching the early light, their marble surfaces beginning to glow with a warm, honeyed radiance that makes them seem less like stone and more like solidified sunlight. This is his home. He is one of many people who live here year-round, whose entire lives revolve around maintaining this sacred place and serving the thousands of pilgrims who ascend the mountain seeking Apollo's guidance. His day begins, as every day in Delphi does, with purification. Before he can enter the sacred precinct, before he can touch any holy objects or perform any of his duties, he must cleanse himself of the mundane world. He walks down the slope to the Castalian spring, where cold, clear water gushes from deep within the mountain and flows in a continuous stream down to the valley below. The spring is sacred to Apollo and to the Muses, those 9 divine sisters who inspire all art, poetry, and music. Legend has it that anyone who drinks from this spring or bathes in its waters will be blessed with poetic inspiration. But for him and the other temple servants, the spring serves a more practical purpose. Its icy water is the perfect way to wash away sleep and prepare the mind for the sacred work ahead. He is not alone at the spring. Other early risers are already there. Temple priests perform their morning ablutions. A few pilgrims who arrived late last night and wished to purify themselves before approaching the oracle. Even some of the local shepherds who bring their flocks to graze on the mountain slopes. All nod politely, but conversation is kept to a whisper. The early morning hours in Delphi are a time for quiet reflection, for allowing the sacred atmosphere of the place to sink deep into one's soul. After he has washed his hands and face and offered a short prayer to Apollo, he ascends back towards the temple but does not go directly there. He has other duties first. He works in the Athenian treasury, one of the many small marble buildings that line the sacred way, the path pilgrims ascend to the temple. Each of these treasuries was built by a different Greek city-state to house their offerings to Apollo and to display their wealth and piety to visitors from rival cities. The Athenian treasury is particularly beautiful. Its walls are covered with marble reliefs depicting the adventures of Theseus and Heracles. But right now, in the grey pre-dawn light, he is less concerned with artistic beauty than with practical matters. He needs to check the locks, ensure no one has attempted to break in during the night, and prepare for the day's visitors. Inside the treasury, the air is cool and still. Golden objects gleam softly in the dim light filtering through the doorway. There are tripods made of precious metals. Their 3 legs are carved to resemble serpents, in honor of Python, whom Apollo slew. There are silver bowls engraved with scenes of battles and feasts. There are bronze mirrors polished to perfection, their surfaces reflecting his face like dark water. But the most precious of all are the offerings that cannot be displayed. Papyrus and parchment scrolls containing records of all the prophecies given by Apollo's oracle spanning generations. These documents are the true treasure of Delphi. More valuable than all the gold and silver combined, they represent hundreds of years of divine guidance, a written record of how a god shaped the history of the Greek world. He meticulously checks each container, ensuring the scrolls are protected from moisture and mice. Some of these prophecies are known throughout the ancient world. Others are private, given to ordinary people asking about ordinary problems. Should I marry this person? Will my sick child recover? Is this a good time to plant my crops? As he works, he hears the temple precinct coming alive around him. Footsteps on the stone pathways, the soft sound of brooms sweeping dust from marble floors, the gentle lowing of cattle being led up the mountain for sacrifice, voices softly calling greetings as the various temple workers begin their daily tasks. By the time he finishes his work in the treasury, the sun has cleared the eastern peaks, and the temple precinct is bathed in golden light. Now comes the most beautiful part of his day, the morning procession. Every day in Delphi begins with a solemn procession from the sacred spring to the temple. Priests dressed in white robes and crowned with laurel wreaths walk slowly along the sacred way, while musicians play flutes and lyres. The melody is always the same. An ancient hymn to Apollo that has been sung in Delphi for so many generations that no one remembers who first composed it. He joins the procession with all the other temple workers and pilgrims who have arrived early enough to participate. The pace is deliberately slow, meditative. It is not just a way to get from one place to another. It is a ritual that helps everyone, priests, servants, and pilgrims, transition from the mundane world of everyday concerns into the sacred realm where gods speak to mortals. As he walks, he passes all the treasuries and monuments that make Delphi famous. The treasury of the Cnidians, with their amazing marble caryatids, columns carved to look like graceful women supporting the roof on their heads. The monument of the Naxians, topped with a sphinx carved from a single block of marble. The treasury of the Thebans, where Alexander the Great once came to ask for Apollo's blessing before he set out to conquer the world. Each building tells a story. Each represents some triumph or tragedy, a moment when a Greek city felt compelled to thank Apollo for his guidance or ask for his protection. Passing them each morning, he is reminded that Delphi is not just a religious site. It is a place where the entire Greek world comes to reflect on its history and plan its future. The procession reaches the temple just in time for the morning sacrifice. A perfect white bull, its horns gilded and its body adorned with garlands of flowers, is led to the altar standing before the main entrance of the temple. The animal seems calm, almost sleepy in the warm morning sunlight. The priests inspect it carefully, looking for any blemish or sign of ill health that would make it unsuitable for offering to a god. But this bull is perfect, as they always are. The people of Delphi pride themselves on offering only the best to Apollo. The animal is quickly and humanely sacrificed. Its blood is poured onto the ancient altar stones while prayers and hymns rise to the brightening sky. The sacrifice serves several purposes. It provides meat for the temple kitchens, where hundreds of people must be fed daily. It creates sacred smoke that carries human prayers into the realm of the gods, and it establishes the ritual purity that allows Apollo to speak through his oracle. You see, the oracle does not operate every day. In fact, she gives prophecies only one day a month, on the 7th day after the new moon, a day sacred to Apollo's birth. And even then, only if the omens are favourable, only if the gods indicate that they are ready to speak with mortals on that particular day. Today is not an oracle day. Today is what the priests call a maintenance day, a time for cleaning and organising, for receiving visitors who wish to make offerings or ask questions about temple procedures, for copying important documents, and for updating the records that track which cities have paid their required tributes to Apollo. Instead of the intense mystical aura that envelops the oracle's prophetic sessions, today a more peaceful, almost domestic atmosphere reigns here. The temple servants diligently clean the marble floors, sweeping away the finest dust, and polish the bronze elements to a mirror shine. Scribes are comfortably settled in shady niches, meticulously reproducing sacred predictions onto newly prepared papyrus scrolls. Skilled craftsmen are busy repairing damage to buildings and monuments, their hammers emitting muffled rhythmic sounds as they strike stone and metal. A significant part of the morning is dedicated to assisting with the systematic organisation of recently arrived gifts brought by yesterday's travellers and worshippers. Among them is a silver cup brought from Corinth, on whose surface was skillfully engraved a plea to Apollo for the protection of their merchant ships. Nearby lay a bronze mirror, a gift from a Spartan woman, whose child was miraculously cured of a fever after her diligent prayers to the deity, and a miniature ivory statuette arrived from one of the distant colonies, striking in its filigree execution, depicting Apollo himself, drawing wondrous sounds from a lyre. Each gift brought required meticulous recording. It was necessary to record the name of the giver, the exact date of the offering, and the essence of their request to Apollo. Such records served a dual purpose, practical and spiritual. From a practical point of view, they allowed temple administrators to keep track of the vast treasuries, ensuring the preservation of property and preventing its loss or theft. In a spiritual sense, these chronicles preserved the memory of each believer's personal connection with the deity, forming a kind of eternal dialogue between Apollo and his devoted worshippers, stretching through the centuries. Around noon, when the sun reached its zenith and the marble columns cast sharp, graphic shadows on the temple floor, the day's visitors began to arrive. These were not the desperate pilgrims whose hearts were overflowing with an urgent need for a prophetic word. Rather, they could be called travellers, wealthy Hellenes from various polis, whose desire was to behold the celebrated sanctuary of the oracle, to bring modest gifts, and upon returning home, to tell their loved ones about visiting the most revered place in the entire civilized world. Often he or she had the opportunity to act as a guide for these visitors, accompanying them through the sacred territory and revealing the history and deep meaning of each building and monument. This activity brought satisfaction, as it provided an opportunity to look at Delphi with fresh eyes, to realize anew how astonishing this place must appear to those who are not its permanent residents. Pointing to a modest but elegant treasury, he or she explained to a well-dressed merchant from Rhodes, this structure was erected in memory of the triumph at Marathon. The Athenians, seeking to express their gratitude to Apollo for his support in crushing the Persian army, dedicated to him 1/10 of all military spoils. The merchant, listening attentively, nodded approvingly. Like most Hellenes, he was well aware of the events of Marathon. However, the direct contemplation of the treasury itself, where Persian gold and silver were stored, lent the legendary battle an extraordinary reality and tangibility. Then he or she showed him the tripods won by victorious athletes in the Pythian Games, a grand festival of Apollo that gathered participants from all corners of the Mediterranean every 4 years. Pointing to the statue of Gelon of Syracuse, he or she mentioned that it was commissioned after his triumph over the Carthaginians. And finally, he or she described in detail how the sacred path was masterfully designed to evoke a sense of gradual ascent to the divine. Each new bend in the path revealed new wonders, while simultaneously intensifying the anticipation of the majestic temple crowning the very summit of the mountain. The merchant showed keen interest, asking insightful questions. He was curious about how priests were selected, how the oracle's prophecies were recorded, and whether consultation with Apollo was available to ordinary mortals like himself. He or she answered these questions to the best of their ability, although some aspects of the oracle's operations remained strictly confidential, known only to the highest-ranking priests. However, he or she could tell him what it was like to dwell daily in this sacred place, how the morning glow illuminating the marble columns never grew old, never lost its novelty, how the melodic sounds of hymns echoing through the mountain peaks imbued even the most mundane activities with deep meaning, and how the ceaseless flow of pilgrims, flocking from all ends of the known world, transformed Delphi into a true centre of the universe, the only place where all the diverse threads of human existence intertwined. As the day inexorably drew to a close, the majestic mountain began to cast long, creeping shadows across the sacred precinct. The day's travellers and tourists descended the slope to find refuge for the night in the town spread out below. Temple servants, having completed their daily duties, gathered for dinner in the communal dining hall, which was cosily situated on the hillside, just below the majestic temple. Their meal was modest, but invariably delicious and nutritious. There was always freshly baked bread on the table, prepared every morning, cheese made from the milk of goats freely grazing on the surrounding mountain pastures, and also olives and fragrant olive oil, wine traditionally diluted with water, as was customary among the Hellenes, meat from the morning sacrifice, skillfully cooked over a fire kindled from aromatic woods, and of course fresh fruits and vegetables, delivered from the fertile valleys lying at the foot of the mountain. However, the true source of sustenance was the conversations unfolding at the long wooden tables. Priests, scribes, and master craftsmen shared impressions and events of the past day. One might mention an exceptionally beautiful offering that arrived from distant Egypt. Another might outline a problem with one of the treasury roofs, requiring immediate intervention before the winter rains. A young priest in turn shared the results of his research into ancient prophecies, seeking to identify hidden patterns in Apollo's divine guidance bestowed through the centuries. These conversations were never rushed or tense. Life itself in this sacred place seemed to imbue people with a special thoughtfulness and tolerance towards one another. Disagreements were resolved promptly and fairly. Even gossip was gentle and harmless. Everyone recognized themselves as part of something much greater than themselves, something that would exist and flourish long after their departure. When full, impenetrable darkness enveloped the mountain, oil lamps were lit throughout the sacred perimeter. The majestic columns of the temple began to glow softly in their flickering light, forming warm islands of radiance within the embrace of the night. It was time for the sounds of night. There was the distant bark of a fox, the gentle hoot of an owl, and the mysterious whisper of the wind rustling through the wild laurel trees on the mountainside. He, or she, made a final round of the treasury, carefully checking all the locks and ensuring the security of all property for the night. Then he, or she, ascended back up the hillside to his humble stone dwelling, carrying an oil lamp to illuminate the familiar path. Before retiring for the night, he, or she, would step outside and gaze up at the stars. Here, atop the mountain, they appeared much closer, brighter, and more countless than they ever seemed in the valleys stretching below. On rare nights, when the air was unusually clear and silent, one could almost imagine hearing music descending from the celestial spheres. Perhaps Apollo's own lyre played melodies too exquisite and beautiful for the ears of mere mortals. The coming day promised new routines, another stream of visitors and pilgrims, and another opportunity to serve the deity who had transformed this mountain into the most sacred place of the ancient world. But this night, drifting into sleep, he or she felt a profound sense of satisfaction, born of meaningful work and the knowledge that he or she was an integral part of something eternal and immeasurably significant. Sometimes, in his or her dreams, he or she discerned the voice of the Pythia herself, the enigmatic priestess who spoke on behalf of Apollo. When the gods deigned to unveil the future to the human mind, her pronouncements were invariably wise and true, though their true meaning was not always immediately grasped. The name of this priestess never appeared in any official temple documents. None of the women who served as Pythia were identified by their personal names in the sacred annals. They were known only as the Pythias, women who served as Apollo's voice, whose personal identity was completely dissolved in their sacred divine function. However, for the purposes of our narrative, let us call her Clio, after the muse of history, for her story deserves to be preserved in memory, even if her true name has been lost to oblivion. Clio was chosen for the sacred post of Pythia when she was already past 50. Her hair was already touched with noble grey. Her face was etched with fine wrinkles, testifying to decades of accumulated wisdom and life experience. Such a choice was not accidental or whimsical. Apollo's priests, based on centuries of experience, understood that young women, however intelligent or spiritually gifted, rarely possessed the inner strength and unwavering stability required to serve as the voice of a deity. For being an oracle meant not just receiving divine inspiration. It implied the ability to withstand the overwhelming power of divine presence, to maintain clarity of mind and a sense of self-dignity, while acting as a channel for the flow of sacred knowledge. This required a deep, unbreakable calm that is typically granted only with years and accumulated life experience. Clio was born in an unremarkable village nestled in the foothills of Delphi, the daughter of a potter whose craft was making simple clayware for the surrounding farmers and shepherds. In her youth, she married a blacksmith and raised 4 children. 2 of them she had to mourn and bury in infancy, a fate tragically common in the ancient world, while the other 2 lived to adulthood and started their own families. Her life was marked by wars and periods of famine, years of abundant harvests and lean ones, as well as the ordinary joys and sorrows that, in essence, make up most of human existence. She prayed to Apollo in difficult times and offered him thanks in prosperous years. Many times over the years she ascended the mountain path to Delphi, sometimes to seek divine guidance, sometimes simply to participate in the solemn festivals that united the entire region in common jubilation. The priests had secretly observed her for many years, though she herself was unaware. They noted how people turned to her for wise counsel during community disputes. They saw her ability to maintain imperturbable calm and deep thoughtfulness even in the most acute moments of crisis. They observed her profound, genuine piety, not the ostentatious, bustling religious fervour that yearns for dramatic signs and wonders, but a quiet, unwavering faith that fully trusts divine wisdom, even when its comprehension is difficult. After the previous Pythia, a servant of Apollo's temple, peacefully passed away in her sleep at the venerable age of 73, the priests of Delphi dedicated many months to diligent prayers and deep reflection. Their goal was to receive divine guidance from Apollo himself regarding who should assume the sacred duties of the oracle. The deity's response manifested through a series of dreams and omens, each unequivocally pointing to the humble potter's daughter, residing in the small village nestled at the foot of the sanctuary. For Clio, this news was a source of mixed feelings. She was deeply honoured by such a high choice, but at the same time felt great fear and realised her complete unpreparedness for the radical transformation her existence would undergo in her new sacred role. The first stage of her transformation involved strict purification rituals. For 30 days, Clio remained in seclusion, in a specially designated dwelling located within the sacred precinct of Delphi. Her diet was extremely austere. Only bread, cheese, pure water, and moderately diluted wine comprised her sustenance. Daily she bathed in the crystal-clear waters of the sacred Castalian spring, striving to wash away not only physical impurities but also to free herself from the burden of worldly attachments and everyday worries accumulated during her ordinary life. Under the guidance of the priests, she learned ancient hymns and prayers, which had been passed down from one Pythia to another through countless generations. Some of these chants were so archaic that their language could barely be recognized as Greek, so different was it from the contemporary tongue. Nevertheless, their melodies possessed an inexplicable, almost mystical power, capable of altering states of consciousness and preparing the mind for direct contact with the divine. Gradually, Clio learned the art of discerning the sacred signs indicating Apollo's readiness to speak through her. These included the barely perceptible rustling of laurel leaves in an utterly windless atmosphere, the unique patterns of vapour rising from the sacred spring on certain days, and a particular quality of light that seemed to thicken around the inner sanctuary of the temple, announcing the deity's presence. However, the most difficult and important lesson for her was the complete renunciation of her own will, personal thoughts, desires, and judgments. She was to become like an empty vessel, entirely ready to be filled with divine knowledge. This task proved to be the hardest, for Cleo had spent 50 years of her life forming and developing her own individuality, her unique approach to understanding problems and making decisions. Now, she needed to learn to cast all of that aside, to become absolutely receptive to everything Apollo wished to convey through her, transforming into a pure channel of divine wisdom. When the day of her first service as oracle arrived, Cleo was overcome with such deep emotion that she could barely manage the short distance from the temple entrance to the sacred tripod, where she was to sit to receive divine inspiration. Her hands visibly trembled as she adjusted the folds of her snow-white robes, and her voice barely quivered as she uttered the introductory prayers. The first pilgrim to seek counsel was a middle-aged farmer from Boeotia. His question, despite its apparent simplicity, was piercingly sincere. His wife had been barren for 15 years of their marriage, and he desperately wished to know if Apollo could show them a path to having children. Taking her seat on the 3-legged bronze chair, Cleo closed her eyes. She focused on deep breathing, striving to calm her wildly beating heart and open her mind to the divine presence. Long, agonizing moments passed in complete silence. Panic began to rise within her. Had Apollo made a mistake in choosing her? Was she doomed to fail at the most crucial moment of her new purpose? And then, suddenly, the god was there. This feeling was not like possession by an alien spirit, as some ancient authors mistakenly believed. Rather, it was akin to her becoming something more than just Cleo, as if her consciousness expanded to encompass knowledge and perspectives inaccessible to an ordinary mortal mind. She felt the farmer's deep, genuine love for his wife, his growing despair, and how their childlessness cast a dark shadow over their entire marriage. However, beyond the surface question, she also saw deeper patterns in his destiny. With divine clarity, she realized that his wife's barrenness was neither a curse nor a punishment, but merely one of those inexplicable sorrows that sometimes touch human lives. And she also saw that a child awaited them, who, though not born of his wife's body, already existed in the world, desperately needing parents capable of giving him their love. When Cleo finally spoke, her voice sounded utterly different, even to her own ears. It was deeper, more resonant, filled with an unwavering, absolute certainty. The child you seek is not the child you expect. Look beyond your blood, and you will find a son who has already awaited your love. The farmer left the temple, somewhat bewildered, yet filled with a new, trembling hope. 3 months later, he returned to Delphi to express his gratitude to Apollo. Recently, a neighboring village had been struck by a plague, leaving many children orphaned. He and his wife had adopted a 7-year-old boy whose parents had passed away, and from the moment they brought him into their home, their dwelling was filled with the genuine joy they had sought in vain for so many years. News of this extraordinarily successful prophecy spread rapidly throughout Greece, as invariably happens when the oracle's guidance proves not only accurate, but also tangibly beneficial. Soon, more pilgrims made the long journey to Delphi, bringing with them questions both profound and utterly mundane. For instance, a young man posed a dilemma. Should he dedicate himself to military service or commerce? Clio, speaking with Apollo's voice, informed him that his greatest triumphs would be achieved not on the battlefield or trade routes, but through the power of words. He subsequently became one of Athens's most celebrated orators. Representatives of one city asked if they should found a new colony across the sea. The oracle instructed them to seek a place where Apollo's ravens gathered in unusually large numbers. They found such a place on the coast of modern Turkey and established a thriving trading port there. One day a mother brought her sick child, asking if the fever would subside. Apollo's answer was complex and deeply metaphorical. The tree that bends in the storm survives, whereas the rigid oak falls. The woman interpreted this as a call to stop force-feeding her child, and instead allow his body to rest and recover naturally. The fever indeed subsided within a few days. As the months passed, Clio immersed herself more deeply in her unique role as the voice of the deity, gaining increasing confidence and mastery. She learned to implicitly trust the flow of divine knowledge passing through her, even when it sometimes contradicted her own human understanding of a situation. In time, she developed her own methods for managing this extremely intense spiritual experience of conveying Apollo's consciousness. These included special breathing exercises, deep meditative practices, and particular ways of preparing her mind and body for the overwhelming presence of all-encompassing divine wisdom. However, she also came to understand that being an oracle meant more than simply receiving celestial messages. It also required an exceptional ability to translate these messages into language that ordinary mortals could not only comprehend, but also effectively apply in their lives. The knowledge Apollo possessed was truly infinite and timeless. He could foresee all conceivable possibilities, all consequences, and all the complex, interconnected patterns that shape human destiny. While the mortal mind operates in linear categories, concrete images and stories with clear beginnings and ends, the divine vision was all-encompassing. This is why Clio learned to be not just a conduit, but a skilled translator. When Apollo revealed to her vast, multifaceted truths about someone's future, she had to find ways to condense this colossal knowledge into concise, memorable phrases that could guide the inquirer toward making wise decisions. Sometimes this required speaking in riddles and metaphors that invited careful reflection. The most celebrated oracles in history were often known for their mysteriousness, not because Apollo enjoyed being enigmatic, but because some truths were too great and complex for direct, literal transmission. When the legendary King Croesus inquired about the advisability of attacking the mighty Persian Empire, Apollo revealed a vision to Clio. Countless armies clashing in furious battles, cities engulfed in flames, and an ancient kingdom reduced to ruins. However, the god also showed her that the question itself was fundamentally flawed. Croesus was interested in military strategy, whereas he should have inquired about wisdom, justice, and the proper use of power. This is why the oracle's famous response was, "If you cross the river, you will destroy a great kingdom." Croesus, filled with pride, immediately assumed it referred to the destruction of the Persian Empire. Only after his crushing defeat did he realize that the great kingdom he had destroyed was his own. The prophecy proved entirely accurate, but it also served as a harsh lesson in humility, reminding that even monarchs must carefully weigh their assumptions and true motives before taking actions that could impact the fates of thousands. The life of an oracle inevitably entailed a particular, profound solitude. Clio could never afford to casually discuss what she saw or felt while channeling Apollo's consciousness. She was strictly forbidden from using divine knowledge for personal gain or to aid her family and friends. She had to strictly observe absolute neutrality and perfect fairness, treating the concerns of mighty kings and humble peasants with equal respect and close attention. Her former friends from the village below found it exceedingly difficult to reconcile themselves with her new sacred role. Indeed, how could one engage in ordinary, casual conversation with a person who speaks on behalf of a god? How could one lament the fickle weather or exchange gossip about neighbours with a woman who had access to boundless divine wisdom? Thus, Clio's closest and deepest relationships were with the other temple servants, the priests who meticulously prepared her for each oracular session, the scribes who diligently recorded her prophecies, and the attendants who maintained the sacred purity of the space where she performed her service. It was these individuals who fully understood the weight of the burden she carried. They saw how deeply exhausted she was after each session of communion with the god, how sometimes she required entire days to fully recover from the incredible spiritual intensity of transmitting divine consciousness. They respected her solitude and her acute need for silence, yet invariably showed care and provided her with necessary support. During the periods when Clio was not performing her duties as oracle, which constituted the vast majority of days, as prophecies were proclaimed only once a month, her existence unfolded peacefully within the sacred precinct. A small garden was entrusted to her care, where she meticulously cultivated herbs essential for temple ceremonies. Additionally, she engaged in spinning wool and weaving, creating fabrics necessary for the sanctuary's needs. A significant portion of her time was dedicated to studying the archival records of previous prophecies, striving to identify hidden patterns that might deepen her understanding of how the god Apollo communicates with the mortal world. At times in the pre-dawn hours, before the temple filled with the bustle of daily activities, she would sit on the stone steps of Apollo's temple, gazing upon the vast valley stretching below. From this vantage point, her gaze encompassed miles in every direction, endless olive groves and cultivated vineyards, humble settlements and rising smoke from hearths, and in the distance, beyond the mountain ranges, the shimmer of the sea was caught. This sight invariably reminded her of the divine perspective, of how Apollo could survey all of human life unfolding before him, like a grand and intricate tapestry. Individual human destinies appeared to her as merely individual, albeit important threads in this majestic fabric, yet part of something incomparably vaster and more multifaceted than any mortal could comprehend. It was in such silent moments that Clio sometimes felt the unseen presence of the deity, even if she was not performing her official duties as a prophetess at that moment. It was not the overwhelming, transformative experience that accompanied prophecy, but rather a delicate awareness of the flow of divine wisdom permeating all creation. She felt Apollo's boundless love for humankind, his sincere desire to guide people toward choices that lead to well-being and true happiness. She was granted an understanding she could never fully convey to others. Apollo's prophecies were not arbitrary pronouncements about a predetermined future. Rather, they were instructions rooted in the natural consequences of human choices. It was wisdom intended to help people align their actions with the profound principles of justice and harmony that govern the universe. Thus, the oracle was not a prediction of an inescapable fate in the modern sense. It could rather be called spiritual mentorship, conducted at the highest possible level, divine wisdom applied to humanity's earthly problems, boundless knowledge filtered through the prism of impeccable compassion. Time flowed relentlessly, leaving its marks. Cleo's hair had turned completely white, as if covered in hoarfrost, and the wrinkles around her eyes deepened. But these were not marks of anxiety or sorrow, but rather testaments to deep wisdom and inner peace. In her sacred role, she found a harmony and tranquility she had never experienced in her former life, a sense of absolute alignment with her true calling. Monthly, new pilgrims arrived in Delphi, bringing with them the same timeless questions that had troubled humanity since time immemorial. Will I find happiness? Will I achieve success? Should I tie my fate to this person? Should I move to that place? How can I understand the will of the gods? And month after month, Cleo, opening herself to the flow of Apollo's wisdom, uttered words that guided these seekers toward more conscious decisions, to a deeper understanding of themselves, and to a more fulfilling life. In her ordinary human consciousness, she could never be absolutely sure of the effectiveness of the advice. She spoke with Apollo's voice. Pilgrims, having received prophecies, immediately left Delphi, carrying the gods' words to their distant homes, where they had to ponder their meaning through the prism of their own life experiences. However, sometimes, after many years, someone would return to Delphi to offer a thank-you offering to Apollo. This might be a successful merchant whose business prospered thanks to the oracle's guidance, or a happy wife who chose a life partner in accordance with divine instruction, or even an entire city that avoided imminent disaster by heeding the gods' warnings. These return visits were a source of the greatest joy in Cleo's life as Pythia. They served as irrefutable confirmation of what she had always deeply believed but could not prove, that Apollo's love for humanity is genuine, that divine wisdom is indeed capable of guiding mortals through the labyrinth of earthly complexities, and that her own mission as the god's herald was truly filled with profound meaning. However, far more significant than the successful prophecies themselves were the profound lessons she learned about the very essence of divine guidance. Apollo never made decisions for people. He never promised easy paths or comfortable outcomes. Instead, he helped people to more clearly understand the options available to them, to more accurately foresee the probable consequences of their actions, and to align their decisions with immutable principles of wisdom and justice that would serve them as a reliable foundation regardless of external circumstances. The god, speaking through Cleo, taught people to formulate deeper questions, rather than simply providing them with the answers they thought they wanted to hear. He encouraged them to more thoughtfully consider their true motives and values. He helped them cultivate an inner wisdom that would serve them throughout their lives, not just in the specific situation that brought them to sacred Delphi. And so, gradually, throughout all the long years of her service as oracle, Cleo came to a deep understanding of how divine guidance should function. It appeared to her not as a magical means for instantly resolving human difficulties, but rather as a path to helping people become more discerning, more thoughtful, more capable of making decisions that lead to true happiness and deep satisfaction. When Clio reached the age of 70, she began to feel Apollo's presence gradually, like a slow ebb tide, leaving her. It happened not suddenly, but with imperceptible gradualness. She realized that her time as oracle was coming to an end, and she was fully prepared for this transition. Her last prophecy was addressed to a young woman who asked a question Clio herself might have asked decades ago. How can I live a life that will have true meaning? Apollo's answer, spoken in the voice of the aging Pythia, was both simple and immensely profound. Listen carefully, speak truthfully, choose wisely, love deeply, the gods demand no more. 3 months later, Clio peacefully passed away in her sleep, like her predecessor. The priests found her in her humble cell within the temple precinct. Her face was serene, and her hands rested on a scroll containing one of Apollo's ancient hymns. She was buried with full honours in the sacred cemetery, located on the mountainside above Delphi. Her grave marked by a simple stone inscribed only with Pythia, faithful servant of Apollo. Her personal name, according to her wishes, was never immortalized. However, her legacy continued to live on. In the wisdom she conveyed, in the guidance she provided, and in the lives she helped improve, through her service as the god's herald. And in the silent moments before sunrise, when the mountain mist curled around the majestic temple columns, and the first rays touched the sacred peaks, the priests sometimes imagined they could still hear her voice, deep and filled with divine authority, uttering truths that would endure for ages, long after marble turned to dust and bronze acquired its patina. But who were these people who ascended this sacred mountain in search of such profound wisdom? What compelled mere mortals to undertake such a difficult journey to Apollo's sanctuary? Let us now follow some of them along the winding path and listen to the questions that weighed heavily on their hearts. The messenger arrived in Delphi 3 days before King Croesus himself, bringing gifts of such extraordinary luxury that even Apollo's priests, accustomed to offerings from the most powerful and wealthy rulers of the ancient world, interrupted their usual duties to gaze at them with undisguised astonishment. First presented was a life-size golden lion, crafted with truly virtuosic skill. Its mane was rendered with such minute detail that each individual hair seemed to catch and reflect the morning light. This lion weighed nearly 500 pounds of pure gold, and 12 men carried it along the sacred path to Apollo's temple. Next came magnificent mixing bowls of gold and silver, each so vast that an adult could bathe in it, their surfaces adorned with intricate scenes depicting gods and heroes. In addition, there were golden cups and silver amphorae, bronze tripods with serpent-shaped legs, and ivory sculptures created by the greatest masters of the age. However, the most striking of all the offerings was a golden altar, a single work of art intended for permanent adornment of Apollo's temple. This altar was inlaid with prayers written in several languages and studded with precious gems gathered from the most distant corners of the then-known world. The priests meticulously catalogued each gift, carefully recording its weight, dimensions, and artistic features in the temple's eternal annals, yet they couldn't help but whisper among themselves, trying to decipher the true meaning of these unprecedented offerings. In their years of experience, the most generous gifts usually heralded the most desperate questions. Their assumptions proved correct. When King Croesus of Lydia finally arrived in Delphi, accompanied by an impressive retinue of nobles, servants, and guards, his question was utterly simple, yet carried consequences capable of reshaping the entire ancient world. Should I wage war against the Persian Empire? To fully grasp the exceptional importance of this question, one must vividly imagine the political climate that prevailed in the ancient world around 550 BCE. For many centuries, the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean had remained relatively stable. Greek city-states firmly held control over the islands and coastal territories. Various kingdoms, among which Lydia stood out, ruled over the interior regions of modern Turkey. Egypt maintained its dominant position in the south, and far to the east the mighty Persian Empire was steadily gaining strength and expanding, though at that moment it had not yet turned its conquering gaze westward. The Lydian kingdom, ruled by Croesus from his capital of Sardis in modern-day western Turkey, was famed for its immense wealth. Its prosperity was so great that the expression "rich as Croesus" still serves to describe a person of almost boundless financial means. This state held key positions on important trade routes connecting Europe and Asia. Moreover, the rivers of Lydia contained gold deposits, which local artisans had learned to process with outstanding, unparalleled skill. However, as Croesus gradually realized, this abundance could be not only a blessing, but also a heavy burden. As his kingdom grew stronger and prospered, it increasingly attracted the attention of ambitious neighbours eager to seize Lydian treasures. At this time, the Persian Empire, led by the young and energetic King Cyrus, was steadily advancing westward. The Persians had already subjugated Media and Babylon, thereby increasing their wealth and swelling their armies. Now, Persian scouts were increasingly appearing on Lydia's eastern borders, and diplomatic messages arriving from the Persian court were becoming more ultimatums and demanding. Croesus faced a truly terrifying dilemma. If he chose to wait for Persia to initiate aggression, he would have to fight a defensive war on his own soil, inevitably leading to widespread destruction for his people and cities. However, if he himself launched an attack, he risked engaging an adversary whose true strength remained a mystery to him, thereby staking the fate of his entire kingdom on a single military campaign. Either decision threatened to lead to inevitable disaster. In this desperate situation, Croesus decided to follow the example of the powerful Greeks, who for generations had turned to the gods when faced with insurmountable problems. He intended to seek Apollo's advice. However, Croesus was not only incredibly wealthy, but also exceptionally cautious. Before fully entrusting the fate of his kingdom to an oracle's prediction, he deemed it necessary to verify the veracity of divine prophecy. To do this, he dispatched messengers to 7 different oracles scattered throughout the ancient world, including Delphi, Dodona, as well as the famous Oracle of Ammon in Libya, and several others. All were given strict instructions to ask the same question on the same day. What is King Croesus doing at this very moment? Meanwhile, on that very day, Croesus performed an act so unusual and peculiar that no mortal could have even guessed what he was doing. He took a young lamb and a tortoise, carefully butchered them, and boiled them together in a bronze cauldron with a bronze lid, doing so in his personal courtyard, hidden from prying eyes. When the messengers returned with answers from the various oracles, only one of them accurately described Croesus's strange activity. The oracle at Delphi, speaking through Apollo's priestess, proclaimed, "I count the grains of sand on the shore and measure the sea. I understand the speech of the mute and hear the silent. The scent has reached my senses of a boiling and bubbling hard-shelled tortoise and lamb's flesh in a bronze cauldron, bronze below and a bronze lid covering it. The impeccable accuracy of this prophecy completely convinced Croesus that Apollo indeed possessed the ability to see across vast distances and penetrate mysteries hidden from mortal eyes. As a sign of gratitude and reverence, he sent his magnificent gifts to Delphi, after which he prepared to ask the very question upon which the future of his kingdom depended. The oracle's answer, when it finally arrived, seemed surprisingly encouraging. If Croesus crosses the Halys River, he will destroy a great kingdom. The Halys River, as was known, served as the natural boundary between Lydia and the Persian Empire. Croesus interpreted this prophecy as an indication that if he invaded Persian territory, he would destroy Cyrus's mighty kingdom and thereby forever secure Lydia's safety. However, it must be remembered that Apollo's prophecies were long renowned for their ambiguity and required extremely careful interpretation. The deity's words always remained technically flawless, but their meaning did not always align with what listeners expected to hear. Encouraged by what he perceived as undeniable divine approval of his military designs, Croesus began preparing the most extensive military campaign in Lydia's history. He forged strategic alliances with Sparta and Egypt, thereby forcing Persia to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. To swell his armies, he hired thousands of mercenary soldiers. Croesus also amassed an impressive quantity of weapons, provisions, and siege equipment, sparing no expense to ensure his troops were best equipped. Preparations for the grand campaign took almost an entire year. During this prolonged period, messengers constantly travelled between Sardis and the capitals of Croesus's allies, meticulously coordinating military strategy and its timing. Lydian gold flowed unstoppably, paying for ships and legions of soldiers, horses and chariots, everything required for the colossal logistical operation necessary to transport and supply a large army in enemy territory. Finally, in the spring of 547 BCE, Croesus, at the head of his troops, crossed the Halys River and invaded Persian lands. The campaign began very successfully. Lydian forces managed to capture several border towns and achieved a series of victories in minor skirmishes against Persian advance units. For several weeks there was a sense that Apollo's prophecy was being fulfilled exactly as Croesus had hoped. But soon King Cyrus arrived on the battlefield at the head of the main Persian army. The two mighty forces clashed in a deadly struggle on the plain near the ancient city of Tyria, located in modern-day central Turkey. The battle was incredibly fierce and lasted from dawn until dusk, incurring huge losses on both sides. When darkness finally fell on the field, ending the battle, neither army had achieved a decisive victory. Croesus, realizing that the Persians were significantly stronger than he had anticipated, decided to retreat to Sardis for winter quarters. His strategic plan was to use the cold months to attract new allies and gather additional reinforcements, and then resume the military campaign in the spring, when weather conditions would be more favorable. This was a perfectly reasonable and well thought-out strategy, typical of the military planning that had ensured Lydia's success for many years. However, Croesus fatally underestimated his opponent. Instead of retreating to winter quarters, like most ancient armies, Cyrus pursued the retreating Lydians with relentless speed and astonishing efficiency. The Persian army reached the walls of Sardis at the very moment Croesus was still completing his defences. The siege began immediately, and in just 14 days Persian warriors managed to find a way to overcome the supposedly impregnable fortifications of the Lydian capital. Croesus was captured in his own palace. His once great army was either completely destroyed or scattered. The wealth accumulated over generations was loaded onto Persian wagons, and the Lydian kingdom, one of the richest and most powerful states of the ancient world, ceased to exist. Apollo's prophecy had come true with devastating accuracy. Croesus had indeed crossed the Halys River, and he had indeed destroyed a great kingdom, but that great kingdom proved to be his own. According to the accounts of the Greek historian Herodotus, who recorded these events approximately 50 years after they occurred, Croesus was initially condemned to be burned alive, destined as a sacrifice to the Persian gods. However, as he stood on the funeral pyre, awaiting the flames to ignite, a piece of wisdom he had once received from a Greek philosopher surfaced in his mind. Many years before the war, a wise man named Solon had visited Croesus's court. The king, with undisguised pride, showcased all his immense wealth and boundless power to his guest, then asked Solon whom he considered the happiest man in the world. Croesus evidently expected to be named as such, but Solon replied that no one could be called truly happy until their life had ended, for fortune could change at any moment. Even the richest and most powerful person could face disaster before their death, and only a life that concluded well could be deemed truly successful. Standing on the Persian pyre, staring death squarely in the face, Croesus finally grasped the true meaning of what Solon had tried to teach him. Thrice he desperately cried out the philosopher's name, Solon, Solon, Solon. Cyrus, hearing these shouts, demanded an explanation. When Croesus recounted Solon's wisdom, the Persian king was so deeply impressed that he immediately ordered the execution to be halted. Instead of taking the life of his vanquished enemy, Cyrus appointed Croesus as one of his advisors, highly valuing his wisdom, so hard-won through an understanding of the impermanence of fortune. However, Croesus's story with Apollo did not end there. As soon as he was able to settle at Cyrus's court and regain some of his former influence, he dispatched another embassy to Delphi. This time, instead of the usual rich gifts, Croesus sent a bitter complaint. How could Apollo have so cruelly deceived him? How could a deity accept his magnificent offerings and then grant him guidance that ultimately led to the complete destruction of his kingdom? The oracle's reply proved characteristically profound and utterly unsympathetic. Apollo, the prophecy stated, had saved Croesus from a fate he well deserved. The god had delayed this fate by 3 years out of his mercy, though Croesus never realized it. Moreover, Croesus had asked the wrong question. He should have asked whether to wage war at all, not merely whether he should wage war against Persia. And if he had doubts about the prophecy's meaning, he should have sent messengers for clarification. Thus, Apollo granted Croesus exactly what he sought, comprehensive and accurate information about the consequences of his intended course of action. However, the deity bore no responsibility for Croesus's own assumptions, for his failure to ask additional, clarifying questions, or for his decision to interpret divine guidance in a way that merely confirmed his existing desires rather than challenging them. Croesus's story became one of the most famous cautionary tales of the ancient world. It was recounted from generation to generation as a vivid example of how even the deepest divine wisdom can be misinterpreted by mortals who approach it with flawed premises and preconceived expectations. However, this ancient story sheds light on a key aspect of how the Delphic Oracle functioned. The predictions emanating from Apollo were never intended to completely relieve people of the burden of decision-making, or to guarantee a favourable outcome of events. Their true purpose was to help questioners more clearly understand their own choices and the deep motivations that prompted their actions. If the Lydian king Croesus had approached the oracle with a genuine willingness to accept guidance, if he had been open to the idea that waging war might not be the optimal solution to his difficulties, then Apollo's enigmatic answer could have guided him toward seeking diplomatic paths, toward developing creative solutions capable of preserving both his own kingdom and peace throughout the region. But Croesus arrived in Delphi already firm in his decision. He craved divine approval for a choice already made, rather than sincere advice regarding its wisdom. Therefore, Apollo granted him a prophecy that, while technically accurate, nevertheless did not prevent the king from making the mistake he was determined to make. The god valued human free will too highly to override it, even foreseeing that someone's choice might lead to inevitable disaster. This profound understanding of the nature of divine guidance, that it is meant to illuminate the spectrum of options and their potential consequences, rather than to dictate or control ultimate outcomes, became a central principle in the oracle's centuries-long work. Rulers and ordinary citizens, as well as kings, learned that Apollo's wisdom was most beneficial to those who approached it, with genuine humility and openness to the most unexpected answers. The story of Croesus also cemented Delphi's outstanding reputation for political foresight. News spread throughout the ancient world that Apollo could discern the rise and fall of kingdoms, the outcomes of great wars, and the long-term consequences of state decisions. This fame inevitably attracted an increasing number of rulers to Delphi for advice, turning the oracle into one of the most influential institutions of ancient politics. However, not all these royal consultations ended in tragedy. Many monarchs, both kings and queens, learned to formulate questions more thoughtfully than Croesus, approaching divine wisdom with the humility and careful consideration required for such guidance. The oracle directed the founding of new colonies, facilitated strategic alliances, aided in the creation of legal systems, and countless other state decisions that shaped the course of Greek civilization. And in most cases, those rulers who followed Apollo's guidance with true wisdom and flexibility found that it led them to justice, prosperity, and a success that could withstand the inevitable turns of fate. But the influence of the Delphic Oracle extended far beyond the decisions made by kings and queens. Ordinary people, farmers and merchants, warriors and artisans, also ascended the mountain path to Delphi, carrying their own questions and their own hopes for divine guidance. Their stories, though less dramatic than the fall of entire kingdoms, were nonetheless no less significant to those who lived them. The elderly farmer's hands trembled slightly as he carefully unwrapped his offering. It was a small bronze figurine of a bull, no larger than his thumb, carefully forged by the village blacksmith and polished to a sheen like gold. It gleamed in the dim temple light. This figurine symbolized months of painstaking savings, coins set aside from the sale of barley and olives, copper obols saved through frugality in everything from lamp oil to winter clothing. His name was Apollodorus, meaning gift of Apollo, and he had walked a 4-day journey from his small farm in Boeotia to reach this sacred mountain. His feet were calloused and blistered. His simple woolen tunic was dusty from the long road. He smelled of honest labour, of earth and sweat, and a faint, persistent scent of the barn where he tended his few animals. He looked incredibly out of place among the marble columns and golden treasuries. This weathered man, whose hands were perpetually stained with soil, and whose vocabulary contained more terms for different types of fertilizer than for philosophical concepts. But Apollo's priests treated him with the same respectful attention as they would kings or wealthy merchants, for the oracle made no distinction between rich and poor when it came to deep human needs. Apollodorus's question was simple in its wording, but it weighed on him like a heavy stone in his chest. His youngest son, barely 16, had expressed a desire to leave the farm and seek his fortune in great Athens. The boy was intelligent and ambitious, chafing at the measured rhythms of agricultural life, dreaming of becoming a merchant or perhaps even a politician in the renowned city. But if the boy left, who would help with the harvest? Who would care for Apollodorus and his wife when they grew too old to work? The farm had belonged to their family for 5 generations. Would it cease to exist with them because their son sought a different path in life? The farmer had spent many sleepless nights agonizing over this dilemma. He loved his son and wished him happiness, but also feared losing everything his ancestors had built. Feared spending his last years in poverty because he was too generous to keep the help he needed close by. When Apollodorus finally knelt before the Pythia and whispered his question, his voice broke with emotion. Should I let my son go to Athens, or should I keep him on the farm where he belongs? The oracle's answer came in the form of a gentle yet profound riddle. The seed that remains in the granary never sprouts, but the seed that falls on stony ground quickly dies. Seek the middle way, a field that is neither too safe nor too dangerous. Apollodorus left Delphi more confused than enlightened. What did Apollo mean by the middle way? How could there be a compromise between staying and leaving? But as he walked home, pondering the god's words deeply, understanding slowly dawned on him. Perhaps he didn't have to choose between keeping his son forever and losing him entirely. Perhaps there was a way for the boy to explore opportunities in Athens while maintaining an unbreakable connection to the family farm. When Apollodorus returned home, he proposed a carefully considered plan to his son. The boy could spend the winter months in Athens, learning about trade and city life, working for one of their distant relatives who owned a small business there. But he had to return every spring for planting and every autumn for harvest, bringing his urban knowledge with him to help improve the farm's operations. This was not the complete freedom the boy dreamed of, nor the absolute security the father hoped for, but it proved to be a workable solution. The son gained valuable skills in Athens and eventually established a successful wine import business in the city, while also introducing new agricultural methods to the family farm. Both father and son prospered, and the farm passed into the next generation, enriched and evolving rather than falling into disuse. Apollo's guidance helped them find a creative solution that neither of them could have imagined on their own. Not far behind Apollodorus on the same mountain path followed a young warrior named Lysander. his bronze armour polished but already slightly dented after his very first campaign. He was barely 20, and possessed the nervous energy of those who had survived battles that claimed the lives of many of his friends. Lysander had fought at Marathon 5 years ago, standing in the dense phalanx formation when the Greeks achieved their incredible victory over the invading Persians. He felt the exhilaration of triumph, the pride of having served his city well, the deep satisfaction of protecting all he loved from foreign domination. But he had also seen things that now haunted his night dreams. The moment his best friend took a Persian spear to the chest and died calling for his mother. The aftermath of battle, when Greek soldiers walked among the wounded enemies deciding who would live and who would die, and how the victory celebration seemed hollow when he remembered the faces of the men who would never return home. Now Athens was planning another military campaign, this time against its former allies in the Delian League, who had ceased paying the tribute that financed the Athenian fleet. Lysander had been selected for promotion to a leadership position, an honour most young men would enthusiastically celebrate. But Lysander was not sure he wanted to spend his entire life as a soldier. The glory of war seemed less important now than when he was 18 and had never seen blood on his hands. He began to ponder other ways to serve his city, perhaps as a teacher, or working in the administration of the growing Athenian Empire, or even as a merchant whose profits could support public works and festivals. His question to the oracle was deeply personal. I have served as a soldier, but war has shown me things I wish to forget. Should I continue military service, or should I seek another path? The Pythia's answer was characteristically layered. A sword that is never drawn rusts, but a sword that is always drawn dulls. Honour requires both strength and wisdom. Serve your city in such a way as to preserve what you defend. Lysander pondered these words for days. What did it mean to serve in such a way as to preserve what you defend? How could he honour his military experience while also honouring his growing understanding that violence should be a last resort, not a first choice? Eventually he found his answer in an unexpected place. Athens needed experienced soldiers to train the city's youth in military skills, but they also needed teachers who could help young people understand the moral responsibilities that come with the ability to wield violence. Lysander became an instructor in the gymnasium, teaching not only the techniques of weapons and battlefield tactics, but also the philosophical principles that should guide a warrior's decisions. His students learned to fight effectively, but they also learned to carefully consider when fighting was necessary and when it was not. They developed the physical courage to face enemies in battle, but also the moral courage to question orders that might bring dishonour to their city. Many years later, when these students assumed positions as military leaders of Athens, their decisions demonstrate both strength of spirit and deep wisdom. They achieve victories in necessary wars with greater effectiveness and prevent unnecessary conflicts with greater regularity. Apollo's guidance, reinterpreted through Lysander's experience and teaching, profoundly impacts Athenian military policy for an entire generation. Following Lysander, a middle-aged woman named Penelope arrives in Delphi, accompanied by her teenage daughter, Melanippe. Both are dressed in modest but impeccably tailored clothing, indicative of their belonging to a respected merchant class, affluent enough to undertake the journey to Delphi, yet not wealthy enough to afford lavish travels. Penelope is a widow whose husband passed away 3 years prior, leaving her in charge of a small but highly profitable business importing fabrics from Egypt and selling them in the markets of Corinth. She managed this enterprise brilliantly, defying the prejudices of male competitors and proving that a woman could comprehend trade routes, skillfully negotiate contracts, and effectively manage staff just as successfully as any man. However, her daughter has now reached maturity and marriageable age, and Penelope finds herself facing a momentous choice that will determine their future. Several men have sought Melanipp's hand, including one whose proposal would be extremely promising for the family business. This man possesses his own fleet of ships, which could significantly expand Penelope's trade operations, and his extensive connections in Great Alexandria could pave the way for new commercial horizons for her goods. But Melanippe does not feel affection for this pragmatic suitor. Her heart is drawn to a young philosopher who possesses modest means and is utterly indifferent to matters of trade, but whose profound dialogue on the principles of ethics, true beauty, and the very essence of the universe ignites genuine intellectual delight in her eyes. Penelope knows well the path most mothers in her situation would choose: arrange an advantageous marriage, guarantee her daughter's financial stability and well-being, augment the family enterprise, and cherish the hope that genuine affection would blossom over time between spouses united by pragmatic considerations. This is a prudent decision, one that most people would recognize as not only rational, but undoubtedly correct. But Penelope also remembers her own marriage. Her husband was chosen by her father based on purely practical considerations. And while genuine affection gradually blossomed between them over time, she invariably wondered how her fate would have unfolded if she had married a man who deeply understood her aspirations and secret dreams. Therefore, her question to the oracle combines both deeply personal experiences and pressing pragmatic interests. Should my daughter marry, guided by love, or should she be guided by cold calculation? How can a mother choose between her child's boundless happiness and her reliable security? The divine Apollo's answer was delivered through the Pythia's words, which seemed addressed to both pilgrims equally. A foundation laid on genuine affection can bear a far greater burden than one resting solely on the glitter of gold. But feelings unsupported by practical wisdom build dwellings destined to collapse at the first gust of ill weather. Strive for a union that equally honours both the dictates of the heart and the dictates of reason. Mother and daughter leave sacred Delphi with ample food for thought. The oracle did not directly point them to a specific path, but provided a solid foundation for a deeper and more conscious analysis of the available options. Over the next few months, they spent many evenings discussing what future Melanippe truly wished to create for herself. The young woman realized that, despite her affection for the philosopher's sharp mind, she also highly valued the independent position and financial security that a thriving business afforded. She did not wish to spend her entire life constantly worrying about material well-being, even at the cost of deep intellectual exchange. Meanwhile, Penelope came to a profound understanding that her daughter's true happiness outweighed any expansion of business horizons. She was capable of maintaining and even increasing her current trade operations without the need for such an advantageous marriage. What she could not replace was Melanippe's chance to find a genuine partnership with someone who would value her sharp mind as highly as her outward beauty. The final decision they jointly make causes widespread astonishment. Melanippe marries the philosopher, but also assumes the role of a full and active partner in her mother's trading business. Her new husband, it turns out, demonstrates an extraordinary gift for mathematical calculations concerning currency operations and supply logistics. This young couple brings both refined intellectual depth and valuable practical skills to the family enterprise. The business rapidly expands under their combined leadership, exploring new trade horizons and introducing innovative approaches in credit and banking, leading them to acquire both material prosperity and deep personal happiness. And their marital union transforms into one of those exceptional partnerships where fruitful practical collaboration only deepens romantic feelings rather than replacing them. These narratives of the farmer who found a middle ground, the warrior who chose the path of a mentor, of the mother and daughter who rejected illusory alternatives, are but a small fraction of the thousands of similar appeals that for centuries brought ordinary people to sacred Delphi. The vast majority of these daily prophecies were never recorded in the temple's official annals. The oracle's guidance intended for monarchs and rulers was carefully preserved, as it profoundly impacted the fates of entire nations. But the recommendations given to farmers, merchants, and young mothers were deemed too individual and specialized to possess broader historical value. However, it was precisely in these ordinary appeals that the essence of what gave Delphi its true sacredness lay hidden. They vividly demonstrated that divine insight was accessible to anyone who came with genuine need and sincere questions. They testified that the gods cared about the well-being of every individual, not just the grand ascents and crushing falls of mighty empires. The Delphic Oracle's answers to ordinary mortals also revealed deep patterns that help us understand how the ancient Greeks contemplated the fundamental questions of existence. Apollo tirelessly inspired people to seek creative alternatives to either-or dichotomous choices. He pointed them towards solutions that harmoniously combined multiple values, be they tradition and innovation, security and development, personal aspirations and family obligations. Divine wisdom emphasized harmony and foresight. He helped people to consider not only immediate consequences, but also how their decisions would affect the fates of their descendants and the well-being of their communities. He inspired them to cultivate virtues such as courage, discernment, and righteousness, but always in a way that was feasible and achievable within their specific life circumstances. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Apollo's guidance addressed to ordinary mortals vividly demonstrated that seeking divine insight by no means implied evading personal responsibility for one's own decisions. The Almighty never made decisions for people. On the contrary, he helped them to more clearly understand the available alternatives, assisted them in viewing their circumstances from a new perspective, and also to develop the inner strength necessary to make wise decisions and bear their consequences with dignity. The farmer who granted his son the opportunity to learn in Athens, while preserving unbreakable family ties. The warrior who managed to find a way to serve both power and peacefulness. The mother who helped her daughter choose love without sacrificing her safety. Each of them had to independently work out the practical aspects of implementing Apollo's guidance. The deity granted insight and a new perspective, but it was up to people to demonstrate the courage and ingenuity so necessary for creating a more dignified life. These partnerships between higher guidance and human responsibility formed one of the key features of Hellenic religion in its most elevated expression. The gods appeared not as detached overlords issuing arbitrary decrees, but as insightful mentors assisting mortals in developing their own capacity for rational judgment. And this capacity for discernment was tested not only in grand, fateful moments of existence, but also in the countless everyday, seemingly insignificant decisions that are, in fact, the determining factors in whether one's existence will bring deep satisfaction or bitter disappointment, whether their relationships will flourish or gradually fade, whether their work will contribute to the prosperity of their community or cause it harm. The Delphic Oracle deeply understood that the daily concerns of ordinary mortals held no less significance than the political crises that prompted monarchs to seek divine guidance. A farmer's decision regarding his son's future might seem inconsequential compared to global questions of war and peace, yet it would have a direct and long-lasting impact on the real lives of people. For this reason, Apollo addressed all who ascended the sacred mountain with genuine questions and open hearts. His insight was available to anyone who sought to listen carefully and reflect deeply on what they heard, and for many centuries this accessibility of divine guidance contributed to the formation of a culture that valued both practical acumen and deep spiritual contemplation, both personal self-realization and communal responsibility. However, how exactly were these mysterious, oracular pronouncements made? What precisely happened when the Pythia entered a trance state and uttered words that seemed to originate from beyond the ordinary horizons of human knowledge? The answers to these questions lie in some of the most extraordinary phenomena ever recorded at any sacred site in the ancient world. Deep within, beneath the majestic temple of Apollo, among the fissures and caves that penetrate deep into the very heart of sacred Mount Parnassus, something extraordinary happens with the rock itself. Water slowly seeps through limestone layers formed in those distant times when this land was covered by ancient seas. This water, heated by the slow but relentless fire of geological processes, returns to the Earth's surface, carrying with it dissolved minerals and mysterious gases from depths no living creature has ever dared to penetrate. Most of these subterranean exhalations are completely harmless, consisting only of water vapor and carbon dioxide, the usual byproducts of water interacting with rock under high pressure and temperature. However, some gases are of a more exotic nature. They form as a result of complex chemical reactions that occur exclusively in very specific geological conditions. The oracle's chambers are located directly above one of the most active of these underground ventilation channels. For more than a millennium, those who visited ancient Delphi spoke of extraordinary phenomena that accompanied the Pythia's pronouncements. They testified to sweet-smelling vapours rising from fissures in the temple floor and an intoxicating aroma that seemed to plunge anyone who inhaled it deeply into an altered state of consciousness. Particular attention was paid to how the oracle herself fell into such a deep trance that, according to witnesses, her personality seemed to transform, and the voice with which she spoke was completely unlike her usual manner of speech. Ancient chroniclers meticulously recorded these phenomena. Plutarch, who himself served as a priest at Delphi in the 1st century CE, left detailed accounts of the mysterious pneuma, a breath or spirit that emanated from the earth's depths and filled the oracle's chamber during prophetic sessions. He described how these vapours had a distinctive, pleasant odour, and how inhaling them apparently induced a state of divine inspiration. Other ancient authors mentioned a sacred fissure in the temple floor, called the Aditon, or Holy of Holies, where access was permitted only to the Pythia. They recounted how she sat on her bronze tripod directly above this earthy crack, inhaling the rising exhalations from the depths, awaiting the moment when Apollo's wisdom would fill her consciousness. However, for many centuries, the scholarly community regarded these ancient descriptions as nothing more than mythological traditions. The idea that geological processes could produce mind-altering gases seemed too convenient, too rational an explanation for what was clearly perceived as a purely spiritual phenomenon. When archaeologists began excavating Delphi in the late 19th century, they found no evidence of fissures or gas vents, which seemed to confirm the assumption that the ancient narratives were merely products of religious fantasy. But in the 1990s, a group of scientists undertook a new investigation of the geology beneath Delphi, using modern methods that were unavailable to earlier researchers. Their discoveries proved truly astonishing. It was found that the Temple of Apollo is built at the intersection of two major fault lines, cracks in the Earth's crust, where subterranean pressure creates ideal conditions for unusual chemical reactions. These faults remain active to this day, periodically causing small earthquakes that have always been common in this region. Even more significantly, the specific type of limestone underlying Delphi contains bituminous deposits, organic material formed from ancient marine life, which, when heated by geothermal processes, can produce ethylene gas. Ethylene is a sweet-smelling compound that in small concentrations causes a mild euphoric effect, and in larger concentrations can induce hallucinations and altered states of consciousness. The scientific expedition managed to detect traces of ethylene in the spring water flowing near the temple, confirming the continuous formation of this gas by geological processes beneath Delphi. Researchers also found evidence that in ancient times, gas concentrations could have been significantly higher, as fault lines were then more active, and subterranean chambers had not yet been disturbed by earthquakes and human excavations. This discovery in no way diminishes the spiritual significance of the oracle's prophecies, but offers a convincing explanation of how the Pythia could enter the deep trance state so vividly described by ancient witnesses. One can imagine the oracle seated on her bronze tripod in the inner chamber of Apollo's temple. The room was small and dimly lit, only oil lamps casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. Beneath her feet came the soft sound of water moving through underground channels, a gentle murmur that seemed to echo her own breathing. She had prepared for this moment for many days, observing purification rituals. She had fasted until her body felt light and almost ethereal. She had bathed in the sacred springs until her skin seemed to glow with its own inner light. She had prayed and meditated until her mind was clear of all personal thoughts and desires, becoming completely open to any divine wisdom that might choose to fill it. Then the oracle inhaled deeply, drawing the temple's atmosphere into her lungs. The air had a distinctive sweetness, almost like honey mixed with flowers, though this aroma was unlike anything she had ever encountered in the ordinary world. As she continued to breathe, this sweetness seemed to spread throughout her body, creating a sensation of warmth and lightness that made her feel as if she were floating above her physical self. Her consciousness began to shift, The boundaries between her and the surrounding world became less distinct. She felt the presence of the pilgrim waiting outside the chamber, their anxiety and hope radiating like heat from a fire. She felt the collective attention of the priests and attendants, their focused concentration adding to the spiritual intensity of the moment. And then, gradually, she became aware of something vast and luminous touching the edges of her mind. It was not Apollo himself. Gods did not appear to mortals in all their divine glory, but something like a shadow or reflection of divine consciousness, filtered through layers of mystery until it became something the human mind could encompass without being destroyed. Knowledge began to flow through her, and it was not her own knowledge. She understood things about the pilgrim's life and situation that no one had told her. She saw connections and possibilities that her ordinary mind could never have grasped. She perceived the intricate web of cause and effect that would shape this person's future depending on the choices they made in response to divine guidance. When the oracles spoke the words, they surprised her as much as they did her listeners. It was her voice, but not her thoughts, her language, but not her knowledge. She heard herself utter prophecies that were both profound and practical, enigmatic and clear, mysterious and perfectly suited to addressing the real questions underlying what the pilgrim thought they were asking. It was this astonishing combination of careful spiritual preparation and gentle chemical influence that made the oracle's service at Delphi possible. The ethylene vapors did not create the prophecies themselves. They merely helped the Pythia achieve a state of consciousness in which divine inspiration could occur. It is important to understand that the ancient Greeks would have seen no contradiction between natural and supernatural explanations for the oracle's abilities. They firmly believed that the gods acted through natural processes, not in defiance of them. The fact that Apollo chose a location where geological conditions facilitated the production of mind-altering vapors would have served as further proof of divine wisdom for them, not as a debunking of divine presence. If one looks at it from their perspective, the question arises, what is the probability that a sacred spring would coincidentally appear exactly where subterranean gases create ideal conditions for a mystical experience? What are the chances that the most spiritually powerful place in the Greek world would also happen to be where natural processes form the perfect environment for divine communication? From the Greek point of view, this was not a coincidence but providence. Apollo chose this specific location precisely because its natural properties made it most suitable for his purposes. The god acted through the earth itself, using the planet's own geological processes to create a place where heaven and earth could meet. Modern scientific understanding of the oracle's trance states also helps explain some specific characteristics described by ancient witnesses. People under the influence of mild ethylene intoxication often experience heightened intuition and pattern recognition. They become more receptive to subtle social cues and emotional undertones that might otherwise be missed. Their thinking becomes more associative and metaphorical, less constrained by the logical limitations that govern ordinary consciousness. These effects would have made the Pythia extremely sensitive to the non-verbal communication of the pilgrims who came seeking guidance. Even without conscious awareness, she would have picked up on body language, tone of voice, subtle word choices, and other clues that revealed far more about people's situations than their explicit questions. Combined with her extensive training in psychology and counseling, which was what the role of an oracle demanded, This heightened sensitivity would have given the Pythia an almost supernatural understanding of human nature and motivation. The ethylene-induced trance state would also have contributed to the oracle's answers being more creative and flexible. Instead of giving logical, straightforward advice based on conscious analysis, she would have drawn from deeper intuitive processes that could synthesize complex information in surprising and insightful ways. This explains why Apollo's prophecies were often enigmatic and metaphorical, rather than straightforward and literal. The oracle was not striving to be mysterious for the sake of mystery. She was communicating from a state of consciousness where truth naturally expressed itself in symbols and patterns, rather than in direct statements. However, mystical vapors alone were not enough to fully explain the extraordinary accuracy and profound wisdom of the guidance emanating from the oracle. Throughout human history, many people have experienced altered states of consciousness, yet not all of them became sources of genuine spiritual insight capable of influencing destinies. The uniqueness of the Pythia lay not only in her ability to enter trance states, but also in her comprehensive training, her deep wisdom, her genuine spiritual development, and, no less importantly, her subtle understanding of human nature. Thus, the oracle at Delphi represented a unique intertwining of both natural and cultural factors. The geological features of the area provided the physical basis for the mystical experience, while the priestess's rigorous spiritual training formed the psychological ground for the subsequent interpretation and transmission of that experience. The institutional support of the temple, in turn, created the necessary social context that allowed the oracle's wisdom to spread and influence the surrounding world. And perhaps the most crucial factor was the cultural expectations of ancient Greek society, which formed the interpretive framework that allowed people to perceive divine wisdom in the oracle's words. This was true even when those words required careful reflection and creative application to become truly useful in daily life. The oracle functioned effectively precisely because all its participants, the Pythia herself, the priests, the pilgrims, sincerely believed in its efficacy. They approached the experience with an open and receptive attitude that alone made genuine spiritual insight possible. They were ready to listen carefully, reflect deeply, and take full responsibility for applying any guidance received. The ethylene vapors were merely one element in this complex and multifaceted system, which included geology, psychology, spirituality, and culture. If any of these elements had been excluded, the oracle could never have achieved its outstanding reputation as a source of wisdom and accuracy. It is remarkable that this scientific understanding of the oracle's mechanisms in no way diminishes its historical and cultural significance. On the contrary, if anything, it makes Delphi's achievements even more impressive and astonishing. The ancient Greeks managed to create an institution that successfully combined natural phenomena, deep spiritual practice, subtle psychological insight, and social wisdom to provide guidance that subsequently helped shape one of the greatest civilizations in human history. They understood, perhaps even better than we do in the modern era, that the sacred and the natural are not opposite categories at all. The divine acts through the world as it truly is, not through violations of the natural order of things. Apollo spoke through the oracle not by suppressing the normal functioning of consciousness, but by creating conditions in which consciousness could function at its highest and most perceptive level. And so, deep in the night, when the pilgrims had retired to their dwellings, and complete silence reigned in the temple, when the oil lamps burned dimly and the majestic mountain was plunged into peaceful darkness. These mysterious vapours continued to rise from the earth's depths. The sweet breath of the mountain flowed unceasingly through the cracks in the temple floor, carrying with it the eternal possibility that divine wisdom remains accessible to any age, any culture, any person who approaches the sacred place with true reverence and an open heart. However, the oracle was only one component of the sacred life of Delphi. Throughout the year, the mountain resonated with music and festive revelry, as people from across the Greek world gathered to honour Apollo at festivals that harmoniously blended religious piety with artistic competitions and athletic achievements. Preparations for these events began months in advance. Stonemasons arrived to repair any damage to the stadium and hippodrome. Merchants set up temporary stalls along every available path. Their colourful awnings created a true labyrinth of commerce that spread across the mountainside like a vibrant tapestry. Innkeepers in the town below expanded their premises, adding rooms and courtyards to accommodate the thousands of visitors who would gather at this sacred site. Every fourth summer, when the season reached its peak and the mountain air shimmered with heat, making the marble temple seem to glow from within, Delphi transformed from a place of quiet pilgrimage into something magnificent and chaotic. It was the site of the Pythian Games, a grand celebration of Apollo that brought together the best athletes, musicians, and poets from all corners of the ancient world. However, the most important preparations were spiritual. Apollo's priests spent weeks performing purification rituals to ensure the entire sacred precinct was ready for the intense religious activity of the festival. Every altar was meticulously cleansed. Every statue was washed and anointed. Every building was blessed with incense and prayers. Travellers arrived in Delphi 3 days before the official start of the festival, often in groups, like the musicians from Athens who hoped to participate in the musical contests that formed the heart of the Pythian Games. Unlike the Olympic Games, which were primarily focused on athletic competitions, the Pythian Games gave equal weight to artistic achievements. After all, this was a festival for Apollo, and Apollo was revered as the god of the lyre as much as he was the god of prophecy. The scene that greeted the arrivals was unlike anything they had ever seen. The usually quiet mountain paths were filled with people speaking dozens of different dialects, athletes from Sparta and Sicily, poets from the islands, musicians from Greek colonies in Asia Minor and southern Italy. The air hummed with excitement and nervous energy as participants prepared for events that would define their reputation throughout the Greek world. The games themselves were held in honour of Apollo's victory over the monstrous Python, commemorating the moment when the young god declared this mountain his sacred domain. But they were also a celebration of all that Apollo embodied: music and poetry, physical perfection, and the harmony between body and spirit that the Greeks considered an integral part of a well-lived life. However, that evening, rehearsing by the light of oil lamps as the mountain plunged into peaceful darkness around them, the music flowed with such perfection that it instilled confidence in the musicians. The lyre strings seemed to sing with their own voices. The notes were pure and true. The flutist's melody intertwined with the harmonies, like a silver thread through golden cloth. The singer's voice soared above it all, carrying ancient words with such power that everyone within earshot ceased their activities to listen intently. The participants, including the group of musicians, found lodging in a temporary camp that sprang up in the olive grove below the sacred precinct. Tents and simple wooden shelters housed hundreds of festival-goers, creating a temporary city that existed only during the games. Campfires burned everywhere, and the smell of roasting meat mingled with the sweet aroma of pine resin and the dusty scent of the summer earth. The group of musicians spent the evening before the opening ceremony rehearsing the hymn to Apollo. They were to perform in the musical competition. It was a piece they had practiced for months, a complex composition telling of Apollo's birth on Delos and his journey to Delphi to claim the oracle. The melody was intricate, requiring precise coordination between lyre, flute, and vocals. One wrong note, one moment of poor synchronization, and months of preparation could be wasted. The first harbingers of trouble did not arrive with armies or siege engines, but with a simple administrative dispute that at first seemed almost ludicrously insignificant compared to what it would eventually unleash. It was 595 BCE, and representatives from the city of Shira arrived in Delphi with what they believed was a perfectly reasonable request. Shira controlled the port where most pilgrims arrived before beginning their journey up the sacred mountain, and the city levied fees for the use of its port facilities. Now they sought to extend these charges to all offerings brought to Apollo's temple. The priests of Delphi were aghast. The oracle had always been financed by voluntary offerings from pilgrims and city-states, gifts freely given in honor of the god who provided divine guidance. The idea of taxing these sacred donations seemed to them a fundamental violation of everything Delphi represented. However, the representatives of Shira were unmoved by religious arguments. They pointed out that their city provided essential services to Apollo's pilgrims: port facilities, storage, lodging for travelers who arrived too late to ascend the mountain. Why should they not receive fair compensation for these services? Why should Delphi reap all the economic benefits of the oracle, while Shira bore the costs of maintaining the infrastructure that made pilgrimage possible? This dispute could well have been resolved through negotiation and compromise. At its heart, it was a kind of commercial disagreement that Greek cities typically settled through arbitration or diplomatic exchange. But unfortunately for all involved, the conflict over port fees became entangled with broader political tensions that were brewing throughout the Greek world. Several powerful city-states were looking for opportunities to increase their influence over Delphi and the oracle. Athens sought to ensure that Apollo's prophecies continued to support Athenian interests. Sparta hoped to prevent its rivals from gaining too much control over Greece's most important religious site. The rising power of Thessaly in northern Greece threatened the traditional balance that had kept Delphi independent of any single political authority. When the Delphic priests rejected the tax demands of the city of Shira, the powerful states of ancient Greece saw this as a convenient pretext for intervention. They sought to advance their own strategic interests, while creating the appearance of protecting religious freedom and ancient sacred traditions. The Amphictyonic League, an influential association of Greek tribes and cities entrusted with safeguarding Delphi, immediately declared Shira's actions an act of sacrilege against Apollo himself. The tax imposed by Shira on offerings was interpreted as a brazen theft from the god, a crime so grave that they asserted it required immediate military intervention for its atonement. However, The true motives hidden behind these statements lay far from the realm of defending religious principles. In reality, it was a struggle for power and control, about who would have the decisive say in making fateful decisions concerning all of Greece. The ensuing First Sacred War dragged on for 10 long years, drawing all the key powers of the ancient world into its orbit. A young Athenian warrior, like many of his comrades, embarked on this expedition, which his native city equipped in support of the League's actions against Syra. In his soul, as in the hearts of most of his fellow soldiers, lived an unwavering belief that he was fighting for the inviolability of the oracle, protecting it from unholy taxation. He had been raised on tales of Apollo's boundless wisdom and Delphi's sacred significance, and the very thought that someone would dare to profit from the pious devotion of pilgrims deeply offended his sense of religious propriety. However, the harsh reality of war that the warrior encountered proved far more convoluted and morally ambiguous than the simple and lofty story of defending sacred tradition that had initially motivated him to serve. The siege of Syra initially unfolded as a typical military operation. The city was tightly encircled, supply lines cut, and engineers began constructing siege engines designed to breach the impregnable walls. But Syra proved excellently fortified and adequately provisioned, and its defenders fought not merely to preserve a tax policy, but for their homes and families. Months passed without any tangible progress. The siege gradually devolved into a grueling war of attrition, consuming colossal resources and yielding only meagre military successes. Soldiers on both sides began to question whether the initial dispute was worth such widespread destruction and suffering. Nevertheless, the political leaders who instigated this conflict had invested too much of their prestige in its outcome to agree to a negotiated settlement. Each side relentlessly escalated its tactics, hoping to achieve a decisive breakthrough that could justify the enormous losses already sustained. Amphictyonic forces began intercepting ships potentially capable of delivering supplies to Syra, effectively establishing a blockade of the entire region and creating significant economic hardship for neutral cities whose well-being depended on maritime trade. Syra responded with daring raids into League territory, attacking farms and villages that had no direct connection to the military campaign. What began as a local conflict over taxation transformed into a total war, affecting the entire eastern Mediterranean. Trade routes were disrupted, agricultural production plummeted. Resources that could have been directed toward constructive purposes were ruthlessly consumed by military operations that benefited no one. The young Athenian continued to participate in the fighting, performing his duty as a soldier and obeying orders. Yet he was increasingly plagued by doubts about whether this war brought anything positive to any of its participants. The initial religious righteousness that motivated the conflict gave way to a simple, irrational impulse of violence. Each side continued to fight primarily because they had been at war for so long that any cessation would be tantamount to admitting defeat. The turning point came when Solon of Athens, one of the most revered legal and ethical thinkers of the Greek world, proposed a solution that proved both militarily effective and symbolically appropriate. Instead of continuing the endless siege, the League forces were to redirect the Pleistus River so that its waters flowed through Syra's water supply system, poisoning the city's wells with hellebore, a poisonous plant sacred to Apollo. This insidious plan worked with devastating effectiveness. Within weeks, the population of Syra was weakened by disease and unable to continue effective resistance. The city capitulated, its walls were destroyed, and its territory declared sacred to Apollo, with a prohibition against cultivation and future settlement. The victory was celebrated as a triumph of divine justice, a punishment sent by Apollo himself through the hands of his worshippers. However, the Athenian warrior, who had seen enough of the horrors of war, came to the bitter understanding that divine justice, when carried out by military force, looks remarkably similar to human cruelty. The sacred war concluded with the preservation of Delphi's independence and the elimination of the threat posed by Syra to the oracle. However, it also set a dangerous precedent that would haunt the Greek world for many centuries. This was the idea that religious considerations could justify destructive military interventions, that the defense of sacred traditions sometimes required the complete annihilation of those who threatened them. Moreover, the war significantly altered the balance of power around Delphi itself. The Amphictyonic League emerged from the conflict with expanded authority over the oracle's operations. Member cities gained significant influence over the selection of priests and the interpretation of prophecies. What had once been a relatively independent religious institution now became more closely integrated with the political structures of the Greek world. Such integration brought both obvious benefits and hidden dangers. The Oracle's council became more politically sophisticated, more attuned to the complex diplomatic realities that shaped relations between cities and kingdoms. However, it also became more partisan, more inclined to reflect the interests of powerful league members rather than to express pure divine wisdom. The First Sacred War, as historians would later call it, established patterns that would be repeatedly echoed throughout Delphi's subsequent history. Whenever the oracle's independence was threatened, whenever political forces attempted to subordinate divine guidance to their own ends, military conflict inevitably followed. But these wars also demonstrated something tremendously important about the oracle's role in ancient Greek civilization. People were willing to fight and die to protect access to divine wisdom, to preserve institutions that linked human communities to transcendent sources of guidance and meaning. 50 years after the destruction of Syra, the Second Sacred War broke out when Phocis attempted to seize control of Delphi by force. This conflict was shorter but no less brutal, ending with the defeat of the Phocians and the execution of their leaders as sacrilegious criminals. A century later, the Third Sacred War became one of the most destructive conflicts in ancient Greek history. Philip II of Macedon used a dispute over Delphi as a plausible pretext for military interventions that ultimately led to Macedonian domination over the entire Greek world. Each of these wars followed a similar pattern. Political disagreements fueled conflicts over the administration of Delphi or the oracle's independence. Religious arguments were skillfully used to justify military intervention. The resulting hostilities caused far greater damage than the initial disputes could justify. And when the battles concluded, the political balance shifted in such a way that future conflicts became more likely, not less. The young Athenian warrior survived the First Sacred War and returned to Athens with an experience that shaped his understanding of both politics and religion for the rest of his life. He had seen firsthand how easily sacred goals could be twisted and used to serve worldly ambitions. He had witnessed the profound disconnect between the noble ideals that initially motivate soldiers and the brutal realities that actually generate wars. But he had also seen something else, the genuine reverence that ordinary people held for Delphi and the Oracle. He realized how shared religious traditions could unite communities that seemingly had little in common. He understood the importance of preserving institutions that remind humanity of its connection to sources of wisdom transcending individual desires or even collective interests. Thus, the sacred wars exposed both the best and worst aspects of ancient Greek civilization. The willingness to fight for transcendent principles vividly demonstrated the deep spiritual commitments of the culture. However, the way these battles were waged revealed the limitations of human nature, the tendency for even the noblest religious motives to be corrupted by pride and ambition, giving way to a simple, destructive impulse of violence. Apollo, speaking through his oracle, continued to give guidance throughout these conflicts. His prophecies helped both to end wars and to prevent them, offering wisdom that transcended the partisan views of the various combatants. But the voice of the god became increasingly difficult to discern when political noise drowned out spiritual silence, when the sacred mountain echoed with the clang of weapons rather than the peaceful whispers of pilgrims seeking divine guidance. These wars also changed the experience of visiting Delphi for ordinary pilgrims. What was once a purely religious journey became a more complex undertaking, requiring careful attention to political events and military risks. Travelers now had to consider not only their spiritual questions, but also the current state of relations between their home cities and the forces controlling access to the oracle. Some pilgrims were deterred by these complexities, preferring to seek divine guidance from local oracles rather than undertake a potentially dangerous journey to Delphi. But many others continued to make the pilgrimage despite the increasing risks, motivated by a deep conviction that Apollo's wisdom, emanating from its primary source, was worth any dangers the journey might entail. These faithful pilgrims often found that their experience at Delphi was deepened rather than diminished by the difficulties they overcame to reach the sacred mountain. The effort required to preserve access to divine wisdom made that wisdom even more precious when it was finally obtained. The sacred wars recorded in the annals of history also served as vivid proof of the astonishing vitality of the Delphic Oracle. For decades marked by incessant military clashes, despite persistent attempts by various powerful states to subjugate or manipulate this ancient institution, Apollo invariably continued to proclaim his will through the lips of his priestess. The core functions of the oracle, its sacred purpose, steadfastly survived the political cataclysms that crushed entire kingdoms and redrew the map of the ancient world. This remarkable survival was not a random coincidence. The oracle persisted because it met deep, fundamental human needs that extended far beyond immediate political boundaries and acute military conflicts. People have always sought and will always seek guidance in making fateful decisions, solace in times of universal uncertainty, and a connection to sources of higher meaning that transcend their immediate life circumstances. As long as these needs remain relevant, such revered institutions as Delphi will find ways to continue their crucial mission, regardless of any external pressures. However, it should not be forgotten that the wars left an indelible mark on the oracle's reputation and influence. What was once perceived as a purely divine, infallible institution gradually came to be seen as a more human organization, subject to the same political pressures and moral compromises that inevitably affect all powerful structures. Prophecies lost some of their mystical, mysterious power when people began to recognize the political calculations that sometimes influenced their interpretation. Thus, the sacred wars marked a turning point in Delphi's centuries-long history, a moment when the oracle's role in ancient civilization became noticeably more complex and ambiguous. The institution retained its significance and influence, but it could no longer claim the absolute spiritual authority that characterized its early centuries. And as the Greek world faced new grand challenges, the rapid rise of Macedonian power, the relentless expansion of Rome, and the profound cultural changes that would ultimately transform all ancient civilization, the oracle had to adapt anew, finding new ways to provide divine guidance in an increasingly complex world. But before facing these coming challenges, it had to endure, perhaps the greatest trial in its entire history, the invasion of the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen. The threat was so overwhelming, so all-encompassing, that only direct divine intervention, it seemed, could preserve Greek independence. The messenger arrived in Delphi in the pre-dawn darkness of a summer morning in 480 BCE. His horse, covered in foam, was exhausted from a desperate ride along the winding mountain trails. He brought news that instilled chilling fear in the heart of every person in the sacred precinct. Xerxes and his countless Persian army had crossed the Hellespont and were relentlessly advancing toward Greece with such immense force that, according to eyewitnesses, it darkened the earth like a locust invasion. The numbers seemed almost unbelievable. Persian heralds claimed that Xerxes commanded over 1 million soldiers, gathered from all corners of his vast empire, stretching from India to Egypt. His fleet included ships from Phoenicia and Cyprus, Egypt and Ionia, manned by the most skilled sailors of the ancient world. This was not just another border skirmish or a political dispute driven by territorial claims. This was a full-scale invasion aiming to conquer and completely absorb the entire Greek world into the Persian Empire. Every major Greek city mobilized for what could be the final battle for Hellenic independence. Athens recalled its citizens from across the Mediterranean. Sparta prepared to lead a coalition of city-states in a desperate defense of Greek freedom. But even the most optimistic military strategists understood that the odds were overwhelmingly against them, which raised a terrifying question for the priests and pilgrims in Delphi. What would happen to Apollo's sacred mountain when the Persians arrived? Xerxes showed little respect for Greek religious traditions during his march through northern Greece. Persian soldiers plundered temples, melted down sacred statues for gold, and unhesitatingly used holy sites as military camps. There was no reason to expect them to treat Delphi any differently, despite its reputation as the most sacred place in the entire Greek world. The temple treasuries held untold riches that had accumulated over centuries. Golden statues and silver vessels, bronze tripods and ivory sculptures, precious gems and rare metals, brought from all corners of the Mediterranean. The value of these offerings could have funded military campaigns for years. No Persian commander was likely to leave such spoils untouched out of respect for a Greek god. More importantly, from a strategic perspective, control of Delphi would give Xerxes an enormous psychological advantage over any Greek cities that continued to resist Persian rule. If the oracle predicted a Persian victory, if Apollo himself seemed to endorse Xerxes' claim to power over Greece, the morale effect on Greek resistance would be truly devastating. So Apollo's priests faced an agonizing decision that tore them between duty and faith. Should they attempt to evacuate the most precious treasures, hiding them in remote caves or sending them to distant colonies where Persian armies might never reach? Should they try to negotiate with Xerxes, offering cooperation in exchange for the protection of the sacred site? Or should they fully trust in the power of their God, believing in his ability to protect his own sanctuary, no matter how overwhelming and irresistible the human threat might seem? The debates continued for several days among the senior priests of the temple, with tension mounting by the hour. Some argued for practical measures, dispersing the treasures, preparing secret hiding places in the mountains, developing contingency plans for the oracle's continued function from other, safer locations. Others insisted that such preparations would demonstrate a lack of faith in Apollo's ability to defend his own sacred land. The discussion became even more urgent when scouts reported that a Persian advance guard had been detached from the main army, with clear orders to proceed directly to Delphi. These were not mere reconnaissance troops or foragers. This was a significant military formation equipped for siege warfare, clearly intended to seize the oracle and its untold treasures before any Greek reinforcements could intervene. The inhabitants of Delphi, priests and pilgrims, merchants and artisans, all whose lives were inextricably linked to the sacred mountain, faced the terrifying prospect of becoming refugees within days. Some families had already begun gathering their most essential belongings, preparing to flee into the mountains before the Persians could encircle the sacred precinct. But then something extraordinary happened. Something that halted the panic and changed the course of events. A delegation of Delphians approached the oracle with a question they had never had to ask before. Should we abandon the sacred precinct to save our lives? Or should we stay and defend Apollo's sanctuary, even if it means our death? The Pythia's answer was immediate and unambiguous, delivered with such certainty that it astonished and shook all who heard it. The god will protect his own. Those who trust Apollo need not fear mortal armies, however numerous or powerful they may seem. Remain at your posts and prepare to witness a divine protection rarely seen by mortals. The prophecy quickly spread throughout the sacred precinct, bringing both comfort and unease to the people who had to decide whether to believe it. Was this genuine divine guidance, or was the oracle simply telling people what they wanted to hear during a desperate crisis? Some families chose to leave despite the prophecy, unwilling to risk their children's lives on what might be wishful thinking disguised as divine revelation. But most of the temple staff, driven by deep faith, chose to stay, trusting in Apollo's protection and their own understanding of the god's omnipotence. The Persian advance guard arrived 3 days later. It was a column of professional soldiers stretching for miles along the winding mountain trails. Their bronze armor gleamed ominously in the summer sun. Their weapons were well maintained and evidently effective. Their discipline was evident in the precision of their movements and the efficiency of their encampment procedures. From the steps of the temple, watching this formidable war machine organize itself to attack the sacred precinct, even the most faithful adherents of Apollo's protection began to wonder if they had made a fatal error. The Persians clearly had the numbers and equipment necessary, to overwhelm any resistance the small temple guard could offer. But as the Persian commander began preparations to assault the sacred precinct, strange things began to happen, as if nature itself rebelled against the invaders. The first sign was the weather, which seemed to come out of nowhere. The summer sky, moments ago clear and blue, suddenly filled with dark clouds that swirled around the mountain peaks like smoke from a huge fire. In the distance, thunder began to rumble, though there were no visible lightning strikes to explain this ominous sound. The Persian soldiers, seasoned veterans of campaigns in all sorts of climates, began to grow uneasy. This was not ordinary weather. The clouds were too dark, the thunder too constant and insistent. The sudden change in atmospheric pressure was too dramatic to be a natural phenomenon. Then the earthquake began. It started as a barely perceptible tremor of the ground, a kind of minor seismic activity common in this geologically active region. But it steadily intensified until the Persian soldiers began to struggle to keep their footing, and their horses reared in panic, maddened with fear. The earthquake reached its peak just as the Persian commander gave the order for his troops to advance toward the temple. Huge boulders torn from the cliffs above the sacred precinct began to rain down on the attacking force. Entire sections of the mountain seemed to shift and slide, creating avalanches that blocked the paths the Persians needed for their rapid advance. But the most striking and terrifying phenomenon, undoubtedly, was the light. Witnesses whose accounts have reached us later described a blinding glow that seemed to emanate from the very depths of Apollo's temple. It was a golden radiance that transformed the marble columns, making them appear like solidified rays of Helios. With each passing minute, the light grew brighter and brighter, until Apollo's temple became almost impossible to look at directly, as if the god himself had descended to earth to stand guard over his sacred abode. In this dazzling aura, some Persian soldiers claimed to see enigmatic silhouettes, tall, shining beings armed with blades of pure light, standing guard around the temple, like celestial sentinels. Whether these visions were genuine supernatural manifestations or hallucinations caused by a combination of primal fear, the recent earthquake, and unusual atmospheric phenomena, their impact on the Persian army's morale proved decisive. The attack failed utterly, never truly beginning. Persian soldiers, known for their bravery and having successfully navigated dozens of military campaigns, fled in panic from what they perceived as direct divine intervention. Their commander, realizing that his troops' morale was severely undermined and the advance could not continue, ordered a retreat to a safe distance to weigh further actions. However, Apollo, apparently, had not finished his judgment on the Persian forces. That night, as the Persians encamped several miles from the sacred precinct, the attacks continued. Wolves descended from the mountains in unprecedented numbers, infiltrating the Persian camp undetected and attacking sentries and sleeping soldiers. These predators showed no fear of human weapons or fire, continuing their assaults with a ferocity that seemed almost supernatural. Simultaneously, a mysterious illness began to spread through the Persian ranks. A fever, initially affecting only a few warriors, rapidly spread, infecting hundreds and leaving them too weak to fight and too sick to march. Persian physicians were baffled by symptoms they had never encountered before, and their usual treatments proved utterly useless. By the third day, the Persian commander had exhausted his patience. He ordered his surviving troops to cease attempts to storm Delphi and rejoin the main army, submitting a report to Xerxes stating that the oracle was guarded by divine forces too powerful for mortal warriors. News of the Persian retreat spread instantly throughout Greece like wildfire, providing a much-needed surge of courage to the Greek resistance. If Apollo could protect his own sanctuary from the world's greatest military power, perhaps the gods had not abandoned Greece to Persian conquest. Perhaps there was still hope for asserting Hellenic independence. The preservation of the oracle also brought tangible strategic advantages. With Delphi still under Greek control, the resistance continued to have access to sacred guidance for making key decisions. Apollo's prophecies helped harmonize the defensive efforts of the various city-states, forming a common strategy that would be crucial for any successful resistance against the Persian invasion. Most notably, the oracle provided guidance that helped the Athenians interpret another ambiguous prediction about wooden walls meant to protect their city. Apollo's advice led them to understand that their ships, rather than their fortifications, were the primary means of salvation, and this guidance proved pivotal in the naval battle of Salamis. But what was the true nature of the events that transpired at Delphi during those 3 days when the Persian attack was repelled? Was it direct divine intervention, natural phenomena occurring at a critical moment for morale, or some symbiosis of supernatural and natural factors? Ancient sources present various versions of the details, but all agree on one thing: the outcome. The Persians retreated. Delphi remained under Greek control, and the oracle continued its operations throughout the invasion crisis. Regardless of whether these events are explained by Apollo's direct intervention or by a striking sequence of geological and meteorological phenomena, the outcome remained the same. Greece's most important religious institution stood firm in the face of the greatest threat to its existence it had ever encountered. Current geological research of the Delphic region convincingly shows that this area is prone to seismic activity, and earthquakes regularly trigger rockfalls and landslides of the type described in ancient chronicles. Weather conditions in the region can also change with astonishing rapidity, especially in the summer months, when temperature regimes create rapid atmospheric instability. It seems quite probable that the Persian attack occurred precisely at a moment when natural forces were creating circumstances that seemed supernatural to people who interpreted them as manifestations of divine will. From this perspective, Apollo's protection of his sanctuary occurred through natural mechanisms, rather than in defiance of them. The god protected his sacred land by utilizing the unique geological and climatic features of the mountains. But even this naturalistic explanation does not diminish the significance of what transpired. The timing was so impeccable, the coincidence so strikingly opportune, that even the most pragmatic minds had to acknowledge something extraordinary had happened. Whether one called it divine intervention or incredible luck, the result was that the morale of the Hellenes soared at the most critical moment, when it was most desperately needed. The Persian retreat from Delphi became one of the most celebrated accounts of divine protection in ancient literature. Narratives of it were passed down orally as proof that the gods actively protected those who safeguarded sacred traditions and cultural independence. This story inspired liberation movements throughout the Persian Empire, instilling confidence in other peoples that their local gods could also protect them from foreign subjugation. For the oracle itself, survival in the face of the Persian threat significantly enhanced its authority and importance. Apollo's prophecies gained even greater credibility due to the demonstration that the god could protect his own sanctuary even from insurmountable military might. Pilgrims flocked to Delphi not only hoping for guidance, but also wishing to personally behold the place where divine intervention had saved Greek civilization. The Persian invasion also marked a turning point in how the oracle perceived political realities. Prior to the crisis, Apollo's prophecies typically focused on personal guidance and local disputes. After the god's display of power in international affairs, the oracle began to engage more actively in the great political and military questions that defined the course of ancient history. This increase in political influence brought both new opportunities and hidden dangers. The oracle's counsel became significantly more influential in shaping historical events, but it also became the subject of intense debate. People began to scrutinize the oracle's prophecies more closely, looking for signs of political bias or deliberate distortion. But in 480 BCE, as news of the Persian retreat spread throughout the Greek world, such anxieties receded into the background compared to the undeniable fact that Apollo's sacred mountain had survived. The god who foresees the future had demonstrated that he was also capable of influencing current events when circumstances called for divine intervention. And in the years that followed, as Greece recovered from the devastating consequences of the Persian Wars, pilgrims continued to ascend the sacred mountain tirelessly, seeking wisdom from a god who had convincingly demonstrated that no earthly power, however mighty, could overcome the divine protection of what is truly sacred. The oracle exists, and with it the most important unbroken thread of the ancient world between human wisdom and divine knowledge endures. However, the Persian crisis also vividly demonstrates the transformation of the Greek world, how the political situation had become unprecedentedly complex, and how the oracle was forced to adapt to serve communities that were increasingly involved in international rather than exclusively local matters. The sacred mountain, which once seemed detached from worldly affairs, had become a focal point of both political and religious influence. And the treasures that pilgrims had offered to Apollo for centuries became not only tokens of piety, but also symbols of the wealth and power that made Greek independence an object worthy of defense. Traveling along the sacred path to the Temple of Apollo, the road winds its way among marble structures so beautiful and exquisitely decorated that each one invariably causes the traveller to pause in reverent contemplation. These are the treasuries, miniature temples erected by various Greek cities to house their gifts to Apollo and to display their wealth, aesthetic triumphs, and piety before the god who speaks through his oracle. Each treasury tells its own past, not only the history carved on its marble reliefs or inscribed in epigraphic texts on its walls, but also a profound chronicle of a community's interconnectedness with the sacred, their understanding of how human achievements should be dedicated to serving higher, transcendent ideals. The Athenian treasury, meticulously restored after the destructive Persian wars using pristine white marble quarried from the majestic Mount Pentelicon, gleams dazzlingly, like freshly fallen snow in the morning sun. Its outer walls are adorned with exquisite metopes, square marble panels on which skilled carvers, whose names are carefully preserved through the ages, depicted the heroic adventures of Theseus and Heracles. However, the true treasure guarded within these walls does not shimmer with gold or silver. It is a collection of humble ceramic shards, simple fragments of broken pottery, which in Athenian democracy served as a kind of ballot. In moments when fateful political decisions were required, citizens inscribed names on these ostraca and dropped them into special urns, thereby determining which leaders would guide the destiny of their city. A natural question arises. Why did Athens choose to dedicate such unassuming objects in a treasury overflowing with golden cups and silver tripods? The answer lies in the fact that these ceramic fragments embody something immeasurably more valuable than any precious metal. The unwavering principle that every ordinary citizen should be granted the right to a voice in matters determining the future of their community. By offering these symbols of democratic will to Apollo, Athens thereby acknowledges that its political system rests on both divine wisdom and human understanding. Above the entrance to this treasury is carved an inscription commemorating its creation. The Athenians dedicated this treasury to Apollo from the spoils of Marathon in gratitude for their victory over the Persians. But this architectural creation symbolizes far more than just a military triumph. It embodies Athens' deep understanding that its democracy and its freedom are priceless gifts from the gods, blessings that demand not only tireless gratitude but also responsible, careful stewardship. Not far from the Athenian treasury stands a smaller, yet no less striking structure, erected by the island of Sipnos. This building gained wide renown throughout the ancient world for its unique caryatids, columns skillfully carved in the form of graceful female figures, supporting the roof on their heads. The sculptor's craftsmanship was so delicate that the cold marble seemed to have turned into living, breathing flesh. Each of these figures embodied a particular aspect of feminine strength and beauty. The Sipnian treasury houses offerings that eloquently testify to the island's unique relationship with Apollo. Sipnos was generously endowed by nature with rich silver mines, which provided the abundance that allowed for such lavish dedications. However, the islanders were well aware of the transient nature of their prosperity. Mineral wealth can be depleted, mines can collapse, and economic conditions can change so rapidly that yesterday's abundance turns into scarcity overnight. Therefore, the Sipnians wisely used their temporary wealth to create something eternal, a tribute to Apollo that would continue to honor the god long after their silver mines were exhausted. Their treasury became a kind of spiritual investment, exchanging material prosperity for lasting divine favor. The most precious contents of this building are not made of silver at all, despite the island's immense wealth. Instead, the treasury carefully preserves a collection of songs, hymns dedicated to Apollo, written by Sipnian poets and engraved on bronze tablets, destined to endure long after human voices fall silent. These musical offerings reflect the islanders' deep understanding that artistic beauty surpasses material luxury, and that creating something truly beautiful is the highest form of service to the god of harmony and proportion. The treasury of the Sicyonians tells an entirely different story. This circular building, erected in commemoration of their victory at the first Pythian Games, boldly departs from traditional rectangular temple design, creating something utterly innovative and visually striking. Its innovative architecture is a vivid reflection of Sicyon's reputation as a center of artistic experimentation, a city where sculptors and painters developed new techniques that influenced Greek art for many centuries. Inside the treasury, alongside the expected offerings of precious metals and exquisite crafts, is a unique collection of wooden models. miniature versions of theatrical sets used in Sicyonian dramatic festivals. These humble objects, skillfully carved from olive wood and painted with mineral pigments, symbolize one of humanity's greatest achievements: the emergence of theatre as a powerful means for exploring moral and philosophical questions through narratives that engage both intellect and deep emotions. These wooden models possess no material value, yet they are invaluable culturally. They represent that pivotal moment when entertainment transformed into education, when simple storytelling evolved into a tool for understanding the deepest questions of human existence. By dedicating these theatrical artifacts to Apollo, Sicyon acknowledges the god's role as patron of all artistic endeavors that help people more clearly understand themselves and the world around them. However, not all treasuries are embodiments of successful communities celebrating their achievements. The treasury of the Cnidians houses one of the most poignant collections of offerings ever dedicated at Delphi. It is a series of marble sculptures depicting refugees who, fleeing destruction, abandon their homeland, carrying their most precious possessions in search of new places to build their lives. Cnidus was devastated by a catastrophic earthquake that rendered the city uninhabitable. Its population dispersed to numerous colonies and foreign cities throughout the Mediterranean. The survivors pooled their meagre remaining resources to create this treasury as a sorrowful monument to their lost homeland and a heartfelt prayer for Apollo's protection during their exile. The sculptures they commissioned are striking in their heartbreaking realism. Deep weariness is etched on the carved faces, unwavering determination in the set of the shoulders, and in every movement the terrible sadness of people who have lost everything familiar and are forced to start anew in unfamiliar lands. But through this sorrow, hope also emerges, the tenacious human unwillingness to succumb to despair. A firm belief that even the most terrible catastrophes can be endured with divine help and the unwavering support of a community. The treasury of Thyidians serves as a reminder to every visitor to Delphi that prosperity and security are fragile gifts, that disaster can strike even the most successful communities, and that true wealth lies not in accumulated possessions, but in the relationships and values that help people rebuild after everything else has been lost. Perhaps the most enigmatic treasury is the one built by the Massaliots, Greeks from the colony of Massalia, now known as Marseille, located in southern France. This building houses offerings that reflect the unique challenges of preserving Greek culture in a foreign land, surrounded by Celtic tribes whose traditions and languages were entirely different from Hellenic customs. The treasury of Massalia contains objects that would seem quite unusual to visitors from the Greek heartland. Here one can see bronze torques worn by Celtic chieftains who became allies of the Greek colonists, silver coins with images blending Greek and Celtic artistic motifs, and weapons combining Greek metalworking techniques with Celtic decorative styles. But the most significant offering is a collection of scrolls containing the constitution of Massalia, a body of laws governing how Greeks could maintain their cultural identity while successfully adapting to life in an alien environment. These legal documents represent one of humanity's earliest systematic attempts to solve the complex problem of multiculturalism, creating institutions that preserved core traditions while allowing for practical adaptation to new circumstances. The Massaliot offerings vividly demonstrate the universal significance of Apollo, The god's wisdom is not limited to the Greek-speaking world, but can guide any community that seeks divine assistance in building just and harmonious societies. The oracle's influence extends far beyond the Mediterranean, impacting the development of Greek colonies in Spain and France, Egypt and southern Italy. Everywhere Hellenic communities took root in foreign lands. Continuing the stroll among these treasuries, the visitor begins to realize that these buildings represent something more than mere expressions of civic pride or religious piety. They are a kind of spiritual museum, a collection of humanity's greatest achievements, offered as gifts to the divine forces that make such achievements possible. The Corinthian treasury houses skillfully crafted models of ships that opened new trade routes between Greece and the Western Mediterranean. The Aetolian treasury carefully preserves examples of standardized silver coins that made international trade possible by creating a reliable medium of exchange. The Theban treasury displays weapons and armor acquired in battles that preserved Greek independence from foreign invasion. Each building celebrates its unique aspect of human ingenuity and courage. Together, they create a comprehensive tribute to everything that makes civilization possible: art and science, law and religion, commerce and martial prowess, individual excellence and communal cooperation. However, the treasuries also illustrate the flip side of Greek achievements. Many of the most exquisite offerings were created with wealth obtained through conquest or exploitation. The gold that adorned Apollo's altars was often mined by slaves toiling in extremely dangerous conditions. The silver that financed numerous artistic commissions sometimes came from tribute exacted from weaker cities. This moral ambiguity adds another layer of depth to the spiritual significance of the treasuries. They serve as a reminder to visitors that human achievements are always a mixed blessing, that even the most beautiful creations can be tainted by the circumstances of their origin. Apollo's wisdom, it was believed, helped people navigate these ethical labyrinths, finding ways to build just and beautiful societies without ignoring the costs that such societies sometimes imposed on others. In the Delian treasury, perhaps, lies the most profound answer to this moral challenge. Delos, being Apollo's birthplace, was simultaneously one of the largest slave markets of the ancient world. The islanders used revenues from the slave trade to finance magnificent dedications to the god, but they also instituted legal protections for slaves and created institutions that helped freed slaves successfully integrate into free society. Their temple offerings included documents establishing these advanced legal codes, demonstrating that communities can acknowledge the moral costs of their prosperity while actively working to mitigate the harm caused by their economic systems. The Delian example vividly shows how divine guidance can inspire people to transform unjust institutions rather than simply accept them as unchangeable realities. As evening falls and the setting sun paints the marble treasuries in golden rose and deep purple hues, it becomes clear that these buildings embody humanity's continuous dialogue with the divine. Each offering is both an expression of gratitude for past blessings and a silent plea for future guidance. Each treasury represents both a triumph of achievement and an acknowledgement of dependence on sources of wisdom transcending human understanding. The treasuries would stand for centuries, steadfastly enduring earthquakes and invasions, political upheavals and cultural transformations. Some would be damaged and subsequently restored. Others would be plundered by conquerors, stripped of their contents. Still others would simply crumble as the communities that built them faded from historical memory. However, Their profound purpose would endure as long as people sought to connect their temporal achievements with eternal values, as long as communities wished to offer their best endeavours in service of transcendent ideals. The oracle at Delphi continues to tirelessly proclaim divine wisdom in response to mortal questions. But the treasuries, girdling Apollo's temple, speak another truth, a truth that human creativity and divine inspiration can work in synergy, creating beauty that outlives the civilizations that gave birth to it. In these marble structures filled with offerings of gold and silver, bronze and ivory, one can see both the grandeur and the fragility of human accomplishments. The visitor can grasp why people continue to climb this sacred mountain, seeking guidance from a God who sees all possibilities, all consequences, all the ways in which mortal choices can serve immortal purposes. The treasuries of Delphi stand as a constant testament to the fruitful cooperation between human endeavour and divine blessing, between temporal ambition and eternal wisdom. They remind everyone who beholds them that the highest achievements of civilization stem not from human pride alone, but from the humble recognition that our greatest successes are gifts that must be returned to the sources from which they came. As the moon rises over Mount Parnassus and silver light bathes the ancient stones of Apollo's sanctuary, the sacred mountain of the oracle settles into the peaceful silence that has marked the end of countless days throughout its long and legendary history. Pilgrims return to their distant homes, carrying with them the divine guidance they sought and memories of this place where heaven and earth seem to touch. The priests complete their evening rituals, ensuring that Apollo's temple remains pure and ready for any seekers who may arrive tomorrow. The treasuries stand in the moonlight splendor, their marble walls securely guarding the offerings that represent humanity's gratitude for divine wisdom. However, the true treasure of Delphi is not contained in any specific building, nor is it locked away in any vault. It lives in the profound understanding that wisdom is always available to those who seek it with a sincere heart. It manifests in the realization that divine guidance continuously flows through the world for anyone humble enough to listen, and it is encapsulated in the idea that the questions people ask can be more important than the answers they think they want to receive. The oracle at Delphi reminds us that the search for wisdom itself is a form of worship, that the path to understanding is sacred, regardless of what destination one reaches. As they ascended the mountain path to Apollo's temple, ancient pilgrims discovered not only solutions to their immediate problems, but also a deeper comprehension of the mysteries that give life meaning. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world pauses between night and day, the sacred vapours still rise from deep within the mountain, carrying with them the eternal possibility that divine wisdom remains accessible to any age, any culture, any person who approaches the sacred with true reverence and an open heart. Thus, the ancient wisdom of Apollo's mountain continues to inspire the pursuit of peaceful dreams, where all questions find answers and every search reaches its completion.